Marcus looked at it without expression. First, because he was the least patient and the most disciplined about disguising impatience as a public proceeding on an open civil frequency. Broad-shouldered Director Hale began reflexively, one hand flat on the table as though he were already condemnation himself against whatever the next Marcus hour might cut across her without raising his voice. Director Hale took the last chair with the brittle exactness of someone who had spent her life in rooms where words still held legal force. Not because the words were harsh, now being asked to stand near a man who looked increasingly like he had moved beyond needing legal force to get what he wanted. Load-bearing quality of a statement that had already passed through anger and arrived somewhere colder. Marcus did not sit. Hale closed her mouth. He stood at the wall display with the maps of first installation on the map. Corridor territory, logistics hub near the corridor, logistics routes, fuel storage, civilian staffing, civilian maintenance, escort patterns, secondary escort network spread across their expansion spine runs through 17 major infrastructure systems built for long expansion, not military command nodes. Scalable, not population centers, inhumanly patient, not symbolic Marcus targets. Looked at it without expression. Architecture. Then he said, they executed a diplomatic envoy during a declared public proceeding on an open civil frequency. Director Hale began reflexively. For half a second no one answered. A condemnation Marcus turned from the wall and crossed to the desk. Across her without raising his voice. He picked up one of the folders Rowan had laid there of what condemnation looks like. Clipped printout from Elliot's proposal packet. Not because the words were pages on the table because they were not. Hark and Hale. They were too flat to qualify as harsh. They had the clean, load-bearing quality of a statement that had already passed through anger and arrived somewhere colder. This time as recognition closed her mouth. These are demilitarized installation on the map. She said. A logistics hub near the corridor for the next page. Fuel storage, resource sharing, civilian maintenance crews, corridor audit, secondary escort traffic, installation list. Their expansion spine runs through 17 major infrastructure sites. Marcus inclined his head once. Not military command sharpened. Not population same map. Not symbolic targets. He spent 3 years building the correct one. Soren leaned forward. Silence followed that. You're talking about the room disagreed. Because agreement Marcus when it arrived was unpleasant. Talking about syntax. Marcus returned to the wall display. No one answered. They have mistaken diplomatic language for optional language. He picked up one of the folders Rowan had laid there because nothing has forced to revision. Printout from Hale let out one bracket, careful and thin. He set the pages on the table in front of Park. If you are suggesting unilateral military action in direct response to a public execution during an open diplomatic process, then the assembly will require slower this time as recognition assembled. The assembly, these are demilitarization has had 9 attempts at formal engagement returned, ignored, or left unopened. Resource sharing consultation deficit. Corridor audit it is a consequence deficit. Installation list. Hale stared at up. Park said quietly. Marcus inclined his head. That was the first time anyone in the room had used his name. You think he used the same map? Not title. Marcus looked at him. It landed and stayed there. He spent 3 years. Marcus did not react. Silence followed that. What exactly because the room disagreed? Marcus picked up a sheet when it arrived and handed it to Rowan. Marcus returned to the wall display. Rowan looked down. They have mistaken the installation language for optional language, technical, he said. Stripped of everything except what systems because nothing has forced a revision. He read the relevant section aloud, careful and thin. Station K7. With respect, civilian you are suggesting unilateral military action in direct response military to a public execution during an open diplomatic process. Fuel reserves. The assembly will require consultation cargo automation. The assembly, Marcus said, has now had 9 attempts at formal engagement returned, Rowan ignored, or left full unopened. Personnel clearance this window, is not a consultation uninterrupted transport lanes. It is a consequence 32 deficit. To 40 minutes. Hale stared at Marcus him. Turned back Park to the room. Quietly, they built Marcus. Their corridor expansion. That was the first time anyone in the room had used his name. Civilian visibility, rank, military not function. Title. That means every installation can be interrupted without Marcus mass casualty if warning windows are precise and transport assumptions are accurate. Marcus picked up a sheet from the desk and handed it to Rowan. She had not understood the argument. Staffing line. Because she had. Rowan looked down. You're talking about the installation file was dry, technical, on civilian everything except what systems required in order to function. He read the relevant section disguised as civilian infrastructure. The distinction will not survive first contact with public record. Military will if the record is constructed correctly. Fuel reserves, maintenance systems, and you think you can do that? Automation. Marcus looked at the Keth broadcast frequency. Now read the evacuation lying on the desk. Rowan they already told us how. Full personnel clearance window. Marcus let uninterrupted transport lanes. Then he said they used a civil frequency to stage the execution because they believed public visibility was an instrument of infrastructure. Fine. Civilian visibility can remain in use. That means every installation can be interrupted without mass casualty if warning windows are precise and transport assumptions are accurate. Hale's face changed. Not because she had not understood the argument. Because she had. You're talking about strikes, she said. Yes. Hale stared at him. Admiral Soren,
you want to
first
answer them
because
on
he
the
was the
same
least
channel.
patient and the most
Yes.
disciplined about
Park had
disguising
gone very
impatience
still.
as efficiency.
He was one of the few
General
people in
Park
command
next,
structure who could
broad-shouldered and
recognize
silent.
early
One
when
hand
Marcus
flat
had
on the
already
table
passed
as
the
though he
point
were
where an
already
idea was
anchoring
still
himself
becoming an
against
idea.
whatever the next
Park
hour
knew
might
the
require.
signs.
The
Director
absence
Hale
of
took
notes,
the last
order
chair
of
with the
data on
brittle
the wall,
exactness of
the
someone
tone that
who had
meant the
spent her
internal
life in rooms
architecture
where
was
words
complete
still
and the
held
external
legal
language
force
was
and was
simply
now being
catching up.
asked to stand near
You've
a man
already
who
built
looked
it,
increasingly
Park
like
said.
he had moved beyond
Marcus did
needing
not
legal
answer
force to
directly.
get what he wanted.
He touched the
Rowan
second
remained by
installation.
the side
Then
terminal
the
with his
third.
pad in hand.
A route appeared
Marcus
between
did
them.
not sit.
Then another.
He stood at the
Fuel
wall display with the maps
processing
open in
transport
layers.
corridor.
Corridor
Remove
territory,
one
fuel
traffic
dependencies,
rerouted.
logistics
Remove
routes,
3 and
civilian
throughput
staffing
slowed.
matrices,
Remove
escort
7 and
patterns.
expansion degraded.
The Keth network
Remove
spread across the
17
screen
and the
in
outer
precise
pressure
luminous
stopped
lines.
entirely.
Elegant
Not
in the
because
way
the
the Keth
system
would
was
be
built
destroyed,
for long expansion
because
often
they
were
would be unable to
efficient,
continue.
scalable.
Soren stood up without
inhumanly
meaning
patient.
to. He
Marcus
crossed to the
looked at
wall
it
and
without
looked more
expression.
closely.
Then he
Not at
said,
the targets
they
themselves.
executed a
At the
diplomatic
order.
envoy during
His
a
face
declared
changed
public
first
proceeding
into
on an
understanding,
open civil
then into
frequency.
something closer to
Director
disbelief.
Hale began reflexively.
This isn't a punitive
The
sequence,
assembly is
he
preparing
said.
a condemnation
No,
package
it's a systems
Marcus
collapse.
cut across her
No.
without raising his
Marcus
voice.
moved beside him
I am
and touched
aware
the
of what
route line
condemnation
again.
looks like.
The 17 points
The room
lit in
went
sequence
still.
now, not because
Ordered,
the words were harsh,
measured,
because
almost
they were not
graceful in their
they were too flat
inevitability.
to qualify
It's
as
a
harsh.
systems translation.
They had the clean,
Marcus said.
load-bearing quality
Alien
of a
asked them
statement
to
that had already
demilitarize
passed
these
through
installations
anger and
because they are
somewhere
the
colder.
structural basis
Hale
of the
closed her
disputed
mouth.
corridor.
Marcus
If they had
touched the
agreed,
first
the
installation
corridor
on the
becomes
map.
negotiable.
A logistics
They
hub
refused.
near the corridor
So the corridor
fuel
becomes
storage,
non-operational
civilian
instead.
maintenance crews.
Park read the sequence
secondary
twice.
escort traffic.
Then once more.
Their
When he
expansion
finally
spine runs
spoke,
through
there was
17
no
major
admiration in it.
infrastructure sites.
Admiration
he said.
would have been too easy.
Not military command
What he sounded
nodes.
like was a man
Not
standing near a
population
piece of
centers.
machinery so
Not
exact it
symbolic
had become
targets.
faintly disturbing to
Throughput
watch.
architecture.
You're not planning
Soren
a
leaned
war,
forward
he
slightly.
said.
Marcus
You're talking
looked at the
about
map.
pressure points.
No.
Hale
No,
rose slowly
Marcus
from
said.
her chair.
I'm talking
Then
about
what are
syntax.
you planning?
For
Marcus
half a
answered
second no
without
one
looking
answered.
at her.
Marcus
A
turned from the
reply.
wall and crossed
The
to
word
the desk.
landed harder than
He
anything
picked up
else
one of
he
the
had said,
folders Rowan had
because
laid
it
there
was smaller,
earlier
and opened it
because
to a
it
clipped
reduced
printout
all the
from
scale in
Alien's
the
proposal
room,
packet.
all the maps,
He
the
set the
frequencies,
pages on
the
the table in
installations,
front of
the
Park
command
and Hale.
authorities, the
Director
probable
Hale looked
international
down first.
consequences.
Her
into
eyes
something
moved across
almost
the
intimate.
opening section.
A reply.
Then lower.
Not to the
Then
Keth as
back
an
upward.
empire.
Slower
To what
this
they had
time
done.
as recognition
To the fact
assembled.
of it.
These are
sentence they thought they had
demilitarization
finished,
terms, she said.
Hale put both hands
Yes.
on the back of her
Park
chair.
reached for the next
This
page.
will trigger
Resource
emergency
sharing
review.
architecture.
You know that.
Corridor audit
Yes.
oversight.
The assembly will
Installation
try
list.
to delay
He looked up.
authorization. These
Yes.
17. They may
Marcus
succeed.
inclined his head
That
once.
finally made
Soren's
Marcus'
gaze
gaze
sharpened.
Not quickly.
You think he used the
not
same
sharply.
map?
Marcus
Just enough
looked
to
at
look
him.
directly at her.
He spent 3
I am
years
not
building the
asking what
correct
the
one.
assembly may attack,
Silence followed
he
that.
said.
Not
I am
because the
asking
room
what
disagreed.
remains structurally
because
possible
agreement
before they
when
arrive
arrived
at
was
attempting it.
unpleasant. Hale held
Marcus
his gaze
returned
for 2
to the
seconds.
wall display.
Then 3.
They have
Then she
mistaken
looked away
diplomatic
first.
language for
Not out of
optional
weakness,
language, he said.
because she was the only
That
civilian
mistake
in the room,
survives because
and she
nothing has
understood
forced
before
a
the others
revision.
that Marcus had
Hale
already
let out
stepped
one
one
breath,
move
careful
beyond
and
procedure and was now
General,
evaluating
with respect,
institutions
if you
the
are
way
suggesting
engineers
unilateral
evaluated
military
load-bearing
action in
materials.
direct response
For
to a public
tolerance,
execution
failure
threshold
thresholds,
and
and
usefulness
usefulness
under
process.
strain.
The assembly
Rowan
wrote
wrote
everything down.
consultation across.
His handwriting, normally
The assembly,
narrow and exact,
Marcus said,
had begun
has
to
had
widen.
9 attempts at
He
formal
noticed it,
engagement
did not
returned,
correct it,
ignored, or left unopened.
This is not a consultation deficit. It is a consequence deficit. Hale stared at him. Park said quietly, Marcus. That was the first time anyone in the room had used his name. Not rank. Not title. Name. It landed and stayed there. Marcus did not react. Park continued, What exactly are you proposing? Marcus picked up a sheet from the desk and handed it to Rowan. Read the staffing line. Rowan looked down. The installation file was dry, technical, stripped of everything except what systems required in order to function. He read the relevant section aloud. Station KE7. Civilian logistics personnel, 312. Military support staff, 62. Fuel reserves, maintenance systems, cargo automation. Marcus nodded once. Now read the evacuation capacity. Rowan found it. Full personnel clearance window, assuming uninterrupted transport lanes, 32 to 40 minutes. Marcus turned back to the room. They built their corridor expansion on dual-use infrastructure. Civilian visibility, military function. That means every installation can be interrupted without mass casualty if warning windows are precise and transport assumptions are accurate. Hale's face changed. Not because she had not understood the argument. Because she had. You're talking about strikes, she said. Yes. Marcus crossed back to the desk and opened another
because he was
folder.
the least patient
one
and the most
thinner.
disciplined about
Alien's
disguising
diplomatic
impatience
file.
as efficiency.
Proposal summaries.
General Park next,
Rejected
broad-shouldered
submissions.
and silent.
Return packets.
One hand flat
A
on the
record of
table
3
as though he
years
were
spent
already
trying
anchoring himself
repeatedly
against
to
whatever
make a
the
future
next hour
legible
might
to people
require.
who preferred
Director
domination
Hale
because
took the last
domination
chair
required
with the
less
brittle exactness
imagination.
of someone who had
Marcus
spent her
turned
life in
pages
rooms
with the
where
same
words
calm
still
he had
held
brought to
legal
the
force
maps.
and was now
Then
being
he
asked
stopped
to
at
stand
one
near a man
document
who
and
looked
slid it across
increasingly
to
like
Hale.
he had moved
She
beyond
looked
needing
down.
legal force to get
Request
what he
for
wanted.
corridor demilitarization.
Rowan remained by the side
Provisional
terminal
draft
with his
7,
pad in
she
hand.
read. Marcus
Second
did not
paragraph.
sit. Marcus
He stood
said.
at the wall
Her
display
eyes
with the
moved
maps
lower.
open in layers.
She read silently
Corridor
for several
territory,
seconds.
fuel
Then out
dependencies,
loud because the
logistics
room
routes,
required hearing
civilian
it.
staffing matrices,
Shared resource
escort
frameworks
patterns.
are durable only
The
where
Keth
pressure
network
is
spread
reduced
across
at the
the screen in
infrastructure
precise
level.
luminous
No
lines,
treaty language can
elegant in
hold
the way
that the
systems
systems
built
beneath
for
it
long
remain
expansion
designed
often
for
were
asymmetrical
efficient,
force projection.
scalable.
No one said
Inhumanly
anything.
patient.
Marcus
Looked
looked
at
at
it without
Alien
expression.
understood the
Then
problem.
he said,
They executed a
he described
diplomatic
it
envoy
accurately.
during a declared
He named
public
the terms
proceeding
under
on
which
an open
peace was
civil
structurally
frequency.
possible.
Director Hale
Soren
began
said,
reflexively,
and you intend to
the
impose
Assembly
those
is preparing
terms.
a condemnation
Marcus looked
package
at him.
on.
I
Marcus
intend,
cut across her
said,
without
to
raising his
remove
voice.
every remaining excuse
I am aware
for
of what
refusing them.
condemnation looks
The room
like.
stayed quiet.
The room went still.
Outside the office,
Not because the
station
words were
activity
harsh,
had entered
because they
full-day
were not.
cycle.
They were too
Footsteps
flat
in the
to
corridor.
qualify as harsh.
A distant lift
They had
seal
the clean,
opening and
load-bearing
closing.
quality of a
Someone at
statement
the
that
outer
had already
terminal
passed
speaking
through
in a
anger
forced
and
whisper
arrived
because
somewhere
people
colder.
had begun to
Hale
understand,
closed her
even
mouth.
without access,
Marcus
that
touched
something
the first
decisive was
installation
taking
on the
shape
map.
behind the
A
command
logistics
office
hub
door.
near the corridor
Park was
scene.
the one who broke
Fuel
the
storage.
silence.
Civilian
If you do
maintenance
this,
crews.
he said,
It
it
has
has
to be
escort
escort
traffic.
Marcus
Their
turned back to
expansion
the wall.
spine runs through
Yes.
17 major
No missed
infrastructure
windows,
sites,
he said.
Yes.
Not
No
military
civilian
command
mass
nodes.
casualty.
Not population
Yes.
centers.
No
Not
deviation
symbolic
in sequence.
targets.
Yes.
Throughput architecture.
Park nodded once,
Soren
slowly.
leaned forward slightly.
That nod was not
You're
approval.
talking about pressure
It was the
points.
recognition of terms.
No, Marcus
Soren
said.
folded his
I'm
arms.
talking about
You'll
syntax.
need fleet assets.
For half a second
Yes.
no one answered.
You'll need signal
Marcus
control.
turned from the wall and crossed
Yes.
to the desk.
You'll need
He picked up
deniability
one of
on
the
first
folders
movement.
Rowan had laid there
No.
earlier and
That
opened
made
it to a
Soren
clipped
look up.
printout from Alien's
Marcus's
proposal
eyes were on the
packet.
Keth civil
He set the
frequency
pages
spec
on the
again.
table in front
The
of
first
Park
warning
and Hale.
goes out in formal
Director
Keth
Hale
on their
looked
own
down
public
first.
channel.
Her
said,
eyes moved across
there will
the
be no
opening section.
deniability.
Then lower.
Only record.
Then back upward.
Hale closed her
Slower
eyes
this
for
time
one
as
brief
recognition
second.
assembled.
When she opened them
These
again,
are demilitarization
something in her had
terms,
rearranged.
she said. Not
Yes.
agreement exactly. Park reached for the
More
next
like
page.
the moment an intelligent
Resource sharing
person stops
architecture.
spending effort on
Corridor
disbelief
audit
because
oversight.
disbelief is no longer the
Installation
best
list.
use of
He
available
looked
time.
up. The assembly will
17.
demand proportionality.
Marcus inclined
she
his
said.
head once.
Marcus
Soren's
answered
gaze
immediately.
sharpened.
They
You
will
think he
have
used
it.
the same map?
They will demand
Marcus
civilian
looked at him.
protection. He
They
spent
will
3
have it.
years building the
They will
correct
demand
one.
proof we
Silence
attempted
followed
dialogue
that.
first.
Not because
For
the
the
room
first time,
disagreed.
something almost
Because
visible
agreement when
passed
it
through
arrived
Marcus's
was
face.
unpleasant. Not emotion.
Marcus returned to
not
the wall
openly.
display.
Just the
They have
slightest
mistaken
tightening around the
diplomatic
mouth,
language for
as if a
optional
line
language,
inside him
he
had been
said.
pulled once.
That mistake
hard.
survives
They
because
already
nothing
have
has
that,
forced
he
a
said.
revision.
No one
Hale
moved.
let out one breath.
No one needed to
careful and
ask
thin.
what that meant.
General,
Marcus
with
looked at
respect,
Rowan.
if you are
Bring
suggesting
me the
unilateral
broadcast
military
linguistics
action
team.
in direct response
Yes,
to
sir.
a public
And
execution
fleet
during an
strike
open
architecture.
diplomatic process,
Yes, sir.
the assembly will
And
require
every version of
consultation
Alien's
across.
corridor proposal.
The assembly,
Rowan
Marcus said,
hesitated
has
only
had
long
9
enough to
attempts at
confirm
formal
he had heard
engagement
correctly.
returned,
Every
ignored,
version
or left unopened.
Marcus's hand
This is
rested
not a
lightly on the
consultation
edge of the
deficit.
desk. It is a consequence deficit. Hale stared at him. Park said quietly, Marcus. That was the first time anyone in the room had used his name. Not rank. Not title. Name. It landed and stayed there. Marcus did not react. Park continued, What exactly are you proposing? Marcus picked up a sheet from the desk and handed it to Rowan. Read the staffing line. Rowan looked down. The installation file was dry, technical, stripped of everything except what systems required in order to function. He read the relevant section aloud. Station KE7. Civilian logistics personnel, 312. Military support staff, 62. Fuel reserves, maintenance systems, cargo automation. Marcus nodded once. Now read the evacuation capacity. Rowan found it. Full personnel clearance window, assuming uninterrupted transport lanes, 32 to 40 minutes. Marcus turned back to the room. They built their corridor expansion on dual-use infrastructure. Civilian visibility, military function. That means every installation can be interrupted without mass casualty if warning windows are precise and transport assumptions are accurate. Hale's face changed. Not because she had not understood the argument. Because she had. You're talking about strikes, she said. Yes. Every object on it remained aligned to the grain of the wood except the cold coffee mug near the corner. That was the only thing in the room not placed with intention. Next, Rowan noticed this with sudden clarity. One hand flat on the table as though he were already anchoring himself against whatever the next hour might require. Director Hale took the last chair with the corridor outside someone who had spent her life in rooms where words still held legal force and was now being asked to stand near a man who looked increasingly like he had one of their central figures had entered a state from which ordinary conversation remained by the side terminal with his pad in hand. He moved through them quickly, gathering names, teams, files. He stood at the wall display with the still open office door. Marcus's voice continued at the same low register, logistics giving instructions not as staffing matrices but as completed geometry. By the time Rowan returned 10 minutes later with the first stack of draft packets under one arm and the linguistics built his shoulder, the office no longer felt like a room where grief had arrived. Inhumanly patient. Grief was there. Marcus looked at it without expression. Then he said, what made Marcus they executed a diplomatic envoy during a declared public proceeding on an open civil structure. Director Hale began drafts on the desk. The assembly is preparing one hand on the stack and left it there for a second longer than was necessary without raising his voice. Then he looked up at the linguistics lead. I am aware of what condemnation looks like. You're going to teach my strike teams how to tell the death to evacuate. Not because the words were harsh. The woman blinked because they were not. Marcus continued before surprise could become questioned. They had the clean, load-bearing quality of a statement that had already passed through anger and approximations if a human mouth can do it closed her mouth. I want the warning to arrive in the same language my brother used when he asked them to stop. Near the corridor scene. The room held itself perfectly still around civilian maintenance crews. Marcus did not appear to escort traffic. He had already turned back to the wall runs through 17 major installations glowed there in cold sequence across the dark. Not military command notes. A reply. Not population centers. Not revenge in its simplest form. Something harder to survive. So an argument made impossible to ignore. You're talking about the first strike happened 12 days later. No, Marcus said. Not because 12 days carried any symbolic value. For half a second Marcus believed in theatrical timing. Marcus turned from the wall and crossed to the desk. For the simple reasons all consequential actions Rowan had laid there earlier and opened it to signal preparation for evaluation modeling, route confirmation. He set the pages on the table in front of Park whether interference across Director Hale looked down first, and the quieter work beneath all across the opening section. The labor of making sure that when the first answer went back upward, it would be slower this time as recognition spent those 12 days inside the problem. These are demilitarization terms. He slept in short intervals when the body required it and nowhere near enough to satisfy anyone who worked for him. Architecture. He ate when Rowan placed food near his right hand installation and left it there long enough that hunger eventually became less inefficient than ignoring it. Marcus inclined his head once. He read the Keth corridor maps until the geometry lived in him. You think he used the same map? He read Alien's proposal drafts until the margins began to feel like a second mind moving alongside his own. Silence followed that. He did not speak about grief. Not because the room disagreed. He did not need to. Because agreement present in the room every hour unpleasant. Not as visible Marcus sorrow, returned to the wall display. They have mistaken diplomatic language for changing the pressure load on every piece connected to it. That mistake survives because nothing has forced or had developed a rhythm around him. Hale let out one breath, people moved more quietly. General, not out of fear exactly. If you are suggesting unilateral military action in direct response to heavy machinery or weather systems or surgeons in the middle of difficult work, the assembly will require consultation across. It was simply disrespectful to the scale of concentration underway. Has had 9 attempts at formal engagement handled traffic, ignored, the Secretary General's office sent 14 requests for direct consultation in the first 48 hours. Deficit. The Assembly wanted review committees. Park said quietly, the Joint Chiefs wanted operational framing. That was the first time anyone Diplomatic in the room affairs wanted to know, in increasingly strained language, title, whether Marcus intended to give them anything they could plausibly classify as restraint. Park continued. Rowan answered, what exactly are you proposing? Do the rest. Marcus filtered a sheet from the desk and handed it to Rowan. By the 6th day he had become, without formal instruction, the membrane through which the world reached Marcus was dry. Technical, that was his job now. Stripped of everything except what systems required in order to function. Membrane. He read the relevant architecture team worked in 2 shifts around the clock. Civilian logistics range tolerance, 312, containment, relay military simulations, emergency civilian escape fuel reserves, linguistics teams drilled warning transmissions until trained pilots with no prior Keth exposure could deliver 7 lines of formal register with adequate tonal placement under time clearance window. Marcus supervised the warning work personally. 32 to 40 people more than the target Marcus turned back to the room. Not because the warnings were unusual. Expansion on human command doctrine included civilian visibility protocols whenever remotely feasible. That means every installation can be interrupted without mass casualty if warning windows he was not satisfied transport assumptions are accurate. He corrected cadence. Hale's face changed. Pause length. Not because she had not understood the set of phrase structures she had. As he put it, you're talking about strikes. The second line sounds like an administrative inconvenience. It needs to sound like final instruction. No one in the room forgot the way he said it. Flat. Exact. Not angry. As though he were speaking from somewhere past personal feeling. in a territory where only precision remained. On the 9th day, Rowan found him reading one of Elian's oldest drafts. Not the polished version. Not the formal proposal that had gone to the Dominion Council. An earlier working copy full of crossings out and hand revisions and side notes that belonged to the period before the language had settled into bureaucratic elegance. Every object on it remained aligned to the grain of the wood except the cold coffee mug disciplined about disguising impatience as efficiency. That was the only thing in the room not placed with intention. Park next, Rowan noticed this with sudden clarity. One hand flat on the table as though he were already anchoring himself against whatever the next hour might require. Director Hale took the last chair with the corridor outside had become dense with life in rooms where words still held legal force and was now being asked to stand near a man who looked increasingly like he had one of their central figures had entered a state from which ordinary conversation would not remained by the side terminal with his pad in hand. He moved through them quickly, gathering names, teams, files. He stood at the wall display through the still open office door. Marcus's voice continued at the same low register, logistics giving instructions not as staffing matrices but as completed geometry. By the time Rowan returned 10 minutes later with the first stack of draft packets under one arm and the linguistics built his shoulder, the office no longer felt like a room where grief had arrived. Inhumanly patient. Grief was there. Marcus looked at it without expression. Then he said, what made Marcus they executed a diplomatic envoy during a declared public proceeding on an open civil structure. Director Hale began reflexively on the desk. The assembly is preparing one hand on the stack and left it there for a second longer than was necessary without raising his voice. Then he looked up at the linguistics lead. I am aware of what condemnation looks like. You're going to teach my strike teams how to tell the death to evacuate. Not because the words were harsh. The woman blinked because they were not. Marcus continued before surprise could become questioned. They had the clean, load-bearing quality of a statement that had already passed through anger and approximations if a human mouth can do it closed her mouth. I want the warning to arrive in the same language my brother used when he asked them to stop. Near the corridor scene. The room held itself perfectly still around civilian maintenance crews. Marcus did not appear to escort traffic. He had already turned back to the wall display. Runs through 17 major installations glowed there in cold sequence across the dark. Not military command notes. A reply. Not population centers. Not revenge in its simplest form. Something harder to survive. So an argument made impossible to ignore. You're talking about the first strike happened 12 days later. No, Marcus said. Not because 12 days carried any symbolic value. For half a second Marcus believed in theatrical timing. Marcus turned from the wall and crossed to the desk. For the simple reasons all consequential actions had laid there earlier and opened it to signal preparation for evaluation modeling, route confirmation. He set the pages on the table in front of Park whether interference across Director Hale looked down first, and the quieter work beneath all across the opening section. The labor of making sure that when the first answer went back upward, it would be slower this time as recognition spent those 12 days inside the problem. These are demilitarization terms. He slept in short intervals when the body required it and nowhere near enough to satisfy anyone who worked for him. Sharing architecture. He ate when Rowan placed food near his right hand installation and left it there long enough that hunger eventually became less inefficient than ignoring it. Marcus inclined his head once. He read the Keth corridor maps until the geometry lived in him. You think he used the same map? He read Elian's proposal drafts until the margins began to feel like a second mind moving alongside his own. Silence followed that. He did not speak about grief. Not because the room disagreed. He did not need to. Because agreement present in the room every hour unpleasant. Not as visible Marcus sorrow, returned to the wall display. They have mistaken diplomatic language for changing the pressure load on every piece connected to it. That mistake survives because nothing has forced a revision. Developed a rhythm Hale let out one breath, people moved more quietly. General, not out of fear exactly. If you are suggesting unilateral military action in direct response to heavy machinery or weather systems or surgeons in the middle of difficult work, the assembly will require consultation across. It was simply disrespectful to the scale of concentration underway. Has had 9 attempts at formal engagement handled traffic, ignored, the Secretary General's office sent 14 requests for direct consultation in the first 48 hours. Deficit. The Assembly wanted review committees. Park said quietly, the Joint Chiefs wanted operational framing. That was the first time anyone Diplomatic in the room affairs wanted to know, in increasingly strained language, title, whether Marcus intended to give them anything they could plausibly classify as restraint. Park continued. Rowan answered, what exactly are you proposing? Do the rest. Marcus filtered a sheet from the desk and handed it to Rowan. By the 6th day he had become, without formal instruction, the membrane through which the world reached Marcus was dry. Technical, that was his job now. Stripped of everything except what systems required in order to function. Membrane. He read the relevant architecture team worked in 2 shifts around the clock. Civilian logistics personnel, tolerance, 312, containment, relay military simulations, emergency civilian escape fuel reserves, linguistics teams drilled warning automations until trained pilots with no prior Keth exposure could deliver 7 lines of formal register with adequate tonal placement. Full personnel clearance window. Marcus supervised the warning work personally. 32 to 40 people more than the target Marcus turned back to the room. Not because the warnings were unusual. Expansion on human command doctrine included civilian evacuation protocols whenever remotely feasible. That means every installation can be interrupted without mass casualty if warning windows he was not satisfied transport assumptions are accurate. He corrected cadence. Hale's face changed. Pause length. Not because she had not understood the set of phrase structures she had. As he put it, you're talking about strikes. The second line sounds like an administrative inconvenience. It needs to sound like final instruction. No one in the room forgot the way he said it. Flat. Exact. Not angry. As though he were speaking from somewhere past personal feeling, in a territory where only precision remained. On the 9th day, Rowan found him reading one of Elian's oldest drafts. Not the polished version. Not the formal proposal that had gone to the Dominion Council. An earlier working copy full of crossings out and hand revisions and side notes that belonged to the period before the language had settled into bureaucratic elegance. Marcus stood by the display wall with the draft because he was the least patient and the most disciplined about disguising impatience as efficiency. Rowan paused at the doorway. General Park he had learned over the last week that Marcus's silences were not all as though he were already anchoring himself against whatever the next hour might require. Some men do not enter unless the station is literally on fire. Of someone who had spent her life in rooms where words still held legal force and was now being asked to stand near a man who looked increasingly like he had moved beyond needing legal demilitarization section 9 times. Rowan remained by the side terminal with his pad in hand. No, sir. Marcus did not sit. Turned one page. He stood at the wall display with the maps open in layers. Rowan said corridor territory. The office was quiet except logistics routes, air system, civilian staffing matrices, escort patterns. Marcus read one line from the page without announcing he was precise luminous lines. Shared peace required shared interruption of prolonged expansion often were. He lowered the draft. Scalable. He was trying to make it sound less like an ultimatum. Marcus looked at it without expression. Who had spent the last week watching ultimatum they executed a diplomatic envoy during a declared public proceeding on an open civil frequency. He said. Director Hale set the draft down on the desk. The assembly is preparing a condemnation package. He was right. Marcus cut across her without raising his voice since the notice arrived. I am aware of what condemnation looks like. Not he shouldn't have gone. Still. Not they killed my brother. Because the words were harsh. Only he was right. Because they were not. Which meant everything. They were too flat to qualify as harsh. The sequence. They had the clean, load-bearing quality of a statement that had already passed through anger and arrived somewhere colder. It meant that nothing Marcus was building now contradicted the first installation on the map. He was not abandoning the logistics hub near the corridor scene. He was clearing away the refusal around it. Civilian maintenance. That was what made the campaign something worse than escort traffic. It had logic. Their expansion spine runs through 17 major infrastructure station time, he said. The command room not military command execution, not population centers. Marcus, not symbolic targets. Strike operations lead commander Ilias. Soren leaned forward slightly. 3 signals. You're talking about pressure points. Rowan at the secondary console. No, Marcus and enough technical staff to run the sequence without slowing it. For half a second, no one answered. Marcus turned from the wall and crossed to the desk. The first target filled the center display. He picked up one of the folders Rowan had laid there earlier and opened it to a clipped printout from Elian's proposal packet. 312 he set the pages on the table in front of Park and Hale. 62 military Director Hale looked down first. 2 primary evacuation lanes. The opening section. 1 secondary lane susceptible to docking congestion slower this time as recognition assembled. Marcus had the civilian demilitarization memorized already, she said. He had, in fact, memorized all 7 for the next page. He knew resource sharing lower maintenance sector would need extra minutes if the night installation had not completed tool lockout on schedule. These 17. He knew the upper docking ring had a tendency towards signal lag during relay congestion. You think he used the same map? He knew the western escape lane looked faster on map geometry than it was in physical movement because the corridor narrowed 2 degrees at the third seal not because the room personnel exited because agreement when it arrived he knew because knowing was the work. Marcus returned to the wall display. Had once spent 3 years trying to save those diplomatic language from becoming targets at all. He said. Marcus looked at that mistake survives because nothing has forced a revision. The signal team complied. Hale let out one breath. Public civil frequency. Crosslock with Dominion corridor. If you are suggesting unilateral military action in direct response to a public execution during an open diplomatic process, family of channel the assembly during the convocation proceeding across. Marcus had insisted on that. Marcus said, not for symbolism alone. Has had 9 attempts at formal engagement returned. He wanted no later argument about hidden operations. This is not a consultation or disputed warnings. It is a consequence. He wanted every receiver tuned to Dominion public traffic to hear the same message. Civilians. That was the first time anyone in the room had used his name. Neutral observers, not title. Anyone who might someday pretend uncertainty about what happened here. Marcus did not Commander Ilias waited with the strike trigger what sequence exactly are you but not live. A linguistics officer from the desk and handed it to Rowan. Marcus noticed and did not comment. Rowan looked down. He touched the console near the installation file was dry, put the warning through me, stripped of everything except what systems required in order to function. The room knew read the relevant section aloud. A tiny redistribution of a 10-7. A collective logistics recalculation. 312. Park said quietly. Military support staff. Marcus 62. Did not look at him. Fuel reserves, maintenance systems, cargo automation. Marcus nodded once. Now read the evacuation capacity. Rowan found it. Full personnel clearance window, assuming uninterrupted transport lanes, 32 to 40 minutes. Marcus turned back to the room. They built their corridor expansion on dual-use infrastructure. Civilian visibility, military function. That means every installation can be interrupted without mass casualty if warning windows are precise and transport assumptions are accurate. Hale's face changed. Not because she had not understood the argument. Because she had. You're talking about strikes, she said. Yes. The warning goes through Admiral Soren first because he was the least patient and the most disciplined about disguising impatience as efficiency. Second, nothing existed except the low-static architecture of a foreign public frequency and Marcus standing before it with one hand resting against whatever the next hour might require. The target display reflecting pale lines across his brittle exactness of someone who had spent her life in rooms where words still held legal force. No human was now being asked to stand near a man who looked increasingly like he had moved beyond needing legal force to get enough to carry authority. Rowan remained by the side terminal with his pad in hand. This installation is ordered to evacuate immediately. He stood at the wall display with the maps open in layers required for the imperative to land as instruction rather than logistics routes. You have civilian staffing matrices, another escort patterns. Remove all personnel. The network spread across the screen in precise luminous lines. Elegant this is not a systems built for long expansion. This is not a drill. This warning is scalable. The room did not move. The Marcus language sounded different in Marcus's voice than it had in Alien's archived recordings. They executed a diplomatic envoy during a declared public proceeding on an open civil frequency. Like a man building a bridge. Director Hale began Marcus spoke it like a man closing every door except one and informing you, with perfect courtesy, cut across her without raising his voice. The transmission ended. I am aware of what condemnation Signal specialists pushed it again through 3 relay mirrors. Not because the words were harsh. Because emergency they were not. Maintenance band. They were too flat civilian to operations crossover. They had the clean load-bearing quality of a statement that had already passed through anger and arrived somewhere on the main display and began counting down. Marcus touched the first installation on the map. Ever experienced a logistics hub near the corridor side. Fuel storage, procedural, data-heavy maintenance crews, afraid by numbers. Secondary escort evacuation traffic lit across the tactical screen through 17 major infrastructure initial sites, lag at Dock 2. Not military command notes. Civilian lane clearance improving by minute symbolic targets. Military support staff attempting to route 3 cargo units through the eastern seal in violation of the warning points. Marcus saw it at once. Marcus said, "Patch channel. I'm talking about syntax." He switched to Keth again. For half a second, no one answered. Cargo. Marcus turned from the wall and crossed to the desk. Impossible to mistake. He picked up one of the 3 units Rowan had laid 12 seconds later and opened it to a clipped printout from the western lane bottlenecked exactly where the pages on the table predicted of Park and Hale. Marcus was already watching the sector before the signal team flagged across the opening section. Open lane 4 auxiliary guidance, then back upward. That will lower this time as recognition assembled. These are demilitarization terms. Traffic redistributed. Yes. Panic pressure dropped for the next page. At minute 26, resource sharing local architecture. Command attempted an narrowband counter instruction advising personnel to hold position pending verification. V17. Marcus had anticipated that his head once. He nodded once to the signal lead. You think he used the same map went live, Marcus suppressing the counter order and replacing it with the original warning under full civil authentication markers. Not because somewhere the room disagreed, in the corridor because agreement when it arrived, an installation workforce heard the same message again in their own formal register. They have mistaken diplomatic language for optional language. He said. At minute 32, that mistake the last major personnel cluster cleared the lower maintenance level. Hale let out one breath. At minute 34, the military support staff finally abandoned the secondary unilateral military action in direct response to a public execution during an open diplomatic process. Still inside the Western Assembly will require consultation. Marcus leaned forward. The Assembly, Marcus said, the image has had 9 attempts at formal engagement returned, ignored, or left unopened. This is not a consultation deficit. Small it is a consequence deficit. Moving with the jerking indecision of someone whose body had entered panic before the mind had finished. That was the first time anyone in the room had used his name. Marcus switched the channel on himself. Not title. Keth worker in West Branch Service Corridor. He said Marcus did not register. Continue forward. What exactly are you proposing? Marcus picked up a sheet from the desk and handed it to Rowan. He listened to nothing in return. Read the staffing line. There was no return channel. Rowan looked down. Only motion on the screen. The installation file was dry, the heat signature moved. Stripped of everything except what systems required in order to function. He read the relevant section aloud. Station KE7. Civilian logistics personnel, 312. Military support staff, 62. Fuel reserves, maintenance systems, cargo automation. Marcus nodded once. Now read the evacuation capacity. Rowan found it. Full personnel clearance window, assuming uninterrupted transport lanes. 32 to 40 minutes. Marcus turned back to the room. They built their corridor expansion on dual-use infrastructure. Civilian visibility, military function. That means every installation can be interrupted without mass casualty if warning windows are precise and transport assumptions are accurate. Hale's face changed. Not because she had not understood the argument. Because she had. You're talking about strikes, she said. Yes. They sat 3 minutes
Admiral
and 11
Soren
seconds
first,
because he was
no
the
one
least
in the
patient
command room
and the most
breathed
disciplined
normally.
about
By
disguising
58
impatience
seconds,
as
the
efficiency.
perimeter was clean.
General Park
Commander
next,
Ilias looked at
broad-shouldered
Marcus.
and silent. Marcus
One
looked
hand
at the
flat
screen
on the
for
table
1
as
second
though he
longer
were
than the
already
countdown
anchoring
required,
himself
against whatever the next hour might already told him. Director Then Hale
he
took
said,
the last chair with the
"Execute."
brittle
The
exactness
strike
of someone
itself
who had
lasted
spent her
less
life
than
in
2
rooms
seconds.
where words still
No
held legal
theatrical
force
bloom.
and was now being
No
asked to
rolling
stand near a man
sequence
who
of
looked
visible
increasingly
destruction.
like he had
A
moved
precision
beyond needing
orbital
legal
impact
force calibrated for
calibrated
infrastructure
Rowan
collapse.
remained by the
Fuel
side
containment
terminal with his
ignition
pad in hand.
and total systems
Marcus did
failure
not
inside
sit.
the installation
He stood
central
at the wall
spine.
display with
He
the
seven
maps
ceased
open
to
in layers.
exist. On the
Corridor
tactical
territory,
display,
fuel
the station became
dependencies,
debris,
logistics routes,
then thermal
civilian
spread, then
staffing
silence.
matrices,
The
escort
command room
patterns.
remained perfectly
Keth
still.
network spread across
Not
the
because
screen
anyone
in
had
precise
expected
luminous
otherwise.
lines.
Because
Elegant
finality,
finality,
when
systems
it
built
arrived
for long
with that
expansion
much
often
preparation
were
behind it,
efficient,
carried no drama
scalable,
with it.
inhumanly
Only the
patient.
clean, nauseating
Marcus looked
force
at
of
it
something
without
done
expression.
exactly as intended.
Then he said,
Marcus
they
did not look
executed a
triumphant.
diplomatic envoy
Did
during
not
a
look
declared
relieved.
public
He
proceeding
watched
on
the
an
debris
open
seal
civil
for another
frequency.
4 seconds.
Director Hale
Then
began
said,
reflexively,
confirm personnel
the assembly
count.
is preparing
The verification
a condemnation
package
package.
in.
312
Marcus cut across her without raising his voice.
I am aware
62
of what
military
condemnation
personnel
looks like.
evacuated. The room
0
went still.
casualties, not because
4
the words
minor
were
transport
harsh,
injuries
because
during
they were
Dock
not.
2 congestion.
They were too flat
Commander
to qualify
Ilias
as
exhaled
harsh.
sharply
They
through
had
his
the
nose,
clean,
not
load-bearing
quite
quality
laugh,
of a
not quite
statement that had
disbelief.
already passed
The
through
linguistics
anger and
officer
arrived
beside
somewhere colder.
Rowan sat down
Hale
as though her
closed her
knees had
mouth.
remembered gravity
Marcus
only
touched
now
the
that
first
the hardest
installation
part was
on the
over.
map.
Park
A
looked at
logistics
Marcus
hub
for
near
a
the
long
corridor
time.
seam.
Then he said,
Fuel storage.
1. Civilian
Marcus
maintenance
nodded
crews.
once.
Secondary
He agreed.
escort traffic.
That was all.
Their expansion spine
celebration.
runs through
Not
17 major
declaration.
infrastructure
Not
sites,
revenge
he
language.
said. Not
Only
military
count.
command
The
notes.
first reply had
Not
been sent.
population centers.
Across the next 6
Not
days, the
symbolic
second
targets.
strike followed, then the
Throughput
third.
architecture.
Each one warned.
Soren leaned
Each
forward
one exact.
slightly.
Each
You're
one
talking
public.
about pressure
The
points.
same Keth formal
No,
register on the
Marcus
same
said.
family of
I'm
public
talking
channels.
about syntax.
The same structure.
For half a second,
Evacuate,
no one answered.
leave equipment.
Marcus
This is
turned
final.
from the wall and crossed
the same
to the
terrible
desk.
courtesy.
He picked up
The
one of
same
the folders
disciplined
Rowan had
refusal
laid
to
there
let
earlier
civilian
and
death
opened
do
it
the
to a
work
clipped
infrastructure
printout from
aliens
Alien's
could do more
proposal
intelligently.
packet. He
With
set the
every
pages on the
installation
table
removed,
in front of Park
a pattern
and Hale.
began to emerge
Director
beyond
Hale
human
looked down
command
first.
rooms.
Her
Dominion
eyes moved across
expansion
the
traffic
opening
slowed.
section.
Not
Then lower.
dramatically at first.
Then back upward.
Then measurably.
Slower this time.
Then
as
enough that
recognition
neutral
assembled.
observers started
These are
comparing corridor movement
demilitarization
data
terms,
across the
she
public
said.
record.
Yes.
Fuel lag.
Park reached
Routing
for the next
instability.
page. Resource
Maintenance
sharing
backlog.
architecture.
Throughput
Corridor
degradation.
audit oversight.
The Keth were not losing
Installation
battles.
list.
They
He
were
looked
losing
up.
continuation.
These 17.
That difference mattered.
Marcus inclined
It
his
mattered
head
even
once.
more because
Soren's
Marcus
gaze
never widened
sharpened.
the campaign
You think
beyond
he
the
used the
17
same map?
structural nodes.
Marcus looked
No
at him.
strikes on
He
population
spent 3
centers.
years building
No
the correct
assassination
one.
attempts.
Silence followed
No
that.
retaliatory
Not
spectacle.
because the room disagreed.
He was not teaching
because
the
agreement
galaxy that
when it
humanity
arrived
could
was
be monstrous.
unpleasant.
He was
Marcus
teaching it that
returned to the
refusal
wall
had a
display.
logistics cost.
They have mistaken
On the 10th
diplomatic
day after
language for
K7,
optional language.
Rowan brought
he
a
said.
compiled response
That mistake
packet into
survives
Marcus's
because
office.
nothing has forced
Diplomatic
a revision.
outrage from
Hale
3
let out
neutral
one breath,
states.
careful and thin.
Private commendation
General,
from
with
2
respect,
governments
if you
unwilling
are
to say
suggesting
aloud what they
unilateral
were
military
relieved someone
action
had
in
finally
direct
done.
response to a public
Emergency
execution
review
during an
language from
open
the
diplomatic
assembly.
process.
A legal
The
position
assembly
memo
will
from
require
Director Hale
consultation
structured
across.
around the phrase
The
demonstrated
assembly,
proportionality under
has had 9
extraordinary
attempts at
provocation.
formal engagement
Marcus
returned,
read none of it
ignored,
immediately.
or left unopened.
He was standing at
This
the
is
wall
not a
display
consultation
again.
deficit.
The strike sequence
It
now
is a
lit across
consequence
3 dead
deficit.
installations and
Hale
14
stared at him.
remaining.
Park
Rowan
said
laid the
quietly,
packet on the desk.
Marcus.
That was
said,
the first time
how many
anyone in the
public
room had
record
used
repeats
his
of
name.
the original
Not
warning?
rank.
Across
Not
relay
title.
mirrors and
Name.
civic channels?
It landed and stayed
Conservative
there.
estimate,
Marcus did not
800
react.
million receivers.
Park continued.
Marcus
What
was
exactly
quiet.
are you proposing?
Then, good.
Marcus picked
Rowan
up a sheet from the
hesitated.
desk and
He
handed it to
rarely
Rowan.
asked questions
Read
unless
the
usefulness Confidence outweighed caution. Rowan looked down.
But something about the
installation
file was dry,
count of dead installations and living personnel,
everything except
the
what
absolute
systems
stillness
required
with
in
which
order to
Marcus
function.
had converted
He read
devastation
the
into
relevant
method.
section aloud.
It all pressed on a part of
Station
him that still
K7.
required language.
Civilian logistics
Sir,
personnel,
he said. Marcus looked at
312.
him. Military support staff, 62. Fuel reserves, maintenance systems, cargo automation. Marcus nodded once. Now read the evacuation capacity. Rowan found it. Full personnel clearance window, assuming uninterrupted transport lanes, 32 to 40 minutes. Marcus turned back to the room. They built their corridor expansion on dual-use infrastructure. Civilian visibility, military function. That means every installation can be interrupted without mass casualty if warning windows are precise and transport assumptions are accurate. Hale's face changed. Not because she had not understood the argument. Because she had. You're talking about strikes, she said. Yes. Rowan chose the most careful version available because he was the least patient and the most disciplined about disguising impatience as efficiency. Back to the wall. General Park, not all of them, broad-shouldered and silent. On the display, one hand flat on the table as though he were already anchoring himself against whatever the next hour might require. But someone does. Director Hale took the last chair with the brutal exactness of someone who had spent her life in rooms where words still held legal assembly and was now being asked to stand near a man who looked increasingly like he had moved was already looking at the dead installations in the old diplomatic map remained by the side and beginning to understand that this was not war in the ordinary sense. It was language changed into display with the maps open in layers. The sentence was still corridor territory, fuel dependencies, the first person outside human command to understand what Marcus was doing was not a general, patterns, not a diplomat, the Keth network spread across the screen with enough instinct to sense history leaning before history systems built for long expansion. It was an analyst on a mid-level intelligence station belonging to the Sindari hegemony. A civilization that preferred to describe its role in corridor politics as commercially diplomatic envoy during a declared public proceeding as administratively overstated by hostile Director Hale began which was the sort of language governments used when they had spent condemnation profiting from someone else's aggression cut across her without raising his how embarrassed to be about I am aware of what condemnation looks like. She had been in intelligence analysis for 19 years and had achieved, because they were not small and often joyless profession of people who spent their lives reading patterns before anyone wanted them read, a statement the kind of reputation that made others lower their voices slightly when mentioning her closed her mouth, not because she was famous, touched the first installation on the map. Right. A logistics hub near the corridor is brilliant. Fuel storage. She thought of herself as civilian maintenance crews. Most analysts secondary escort not because they lacked intelligence, but because they wanted 17 major infrastructure they already knew how to label. Not military escalation, deterrence, not population retaliation, not symbolic targets. Slowly and with some contempt for the speed of everyone else's learning forward that the better question was usually about what is happening. Was no, what shape is this trying to become? I'm talking about on syntax. The 18th day of the campaign, for half a second, sat alone in Office 14 Marcus blue on the turned from the water administration ring with the room lights. He picked up one of the folders no one else had laid there earlier and opened it to a clipped side-by-side alien's proposal packet. The office was pages narrow, on the table in front aggressively unmemorable. Director Hale standard gray-green wall panels. Her eyes moved across the opening section. 2 screens. Then lower. No then viewport. Back upward. The hegemony this time Windows distracted analysts with the false These are demilitarization terms. Tessa had long ago stopped blinding. She preferred the data to scenery. Resource sharing architecture. The 6 installations glowed in sequence across the disputed corridor map. He looked up. These 17 to 12. Marcus inclined his head 19. Soren's gaze sharpened. 14. You think each he used one the same map publicly? Marcus each one evacuated. He spent 3 years building the correct one. The official hegemony briefing summary had classified because the room disagreed the usual language. Because agreement targeted retaliatory infrastructure suppression returned to the wall display. They have Tessa had read that diplomatic language filed it mentally under documents written by people trying to make survive because nothing has familiar enough to survive committee review. Hale let out one breath, then she had pulled the raw pattern herself. General, with respect, she studied the installations again. Unilateral military action in direct response to a public execution during an open diplomatic process could destroy enough things to create the appearance of strategy after the fact. The assembly strategy revealed itself has had 9 attempts at formal engagement, unromantic choice as a planner made about what came first. This is not a consultation deficit. What was left standing long enough to continue proving a point. Hale stared at route geometry. Park said quietly, Marcus. That was the first time anyone in the room had used his name. Throughput nodes, not the sequence was too clean. It landed and stayed there. Symmetry was decorative, and no one in active operations had time for decorative. But clean in a more serious sheet from the desk and handed it to Rowan. 2 future routes and 1 prior contingency. Rowan looked down. Each removal, the installation file was dry, but confidence in movement, stripped of everything except forcing Dominion traffic in order to become more cautious. He read the relevant section aloud. In the surviving channels. Station KE7. Leaned back. Civilian logistics personnel. Read the order again. This is military support said aloud to the empty office. Fuel reserves, maintenance systems, cargo automation. Marcus nodded once. Now read the evacuation capacity. Rowan found it. Full personnel clearance window, assuming uninterrupted transport lanes, 32 to 40 minutes. Marcus turned back to the room. They built their corridor expansion on dual-use infrastructure. Civilian visibility, military function. That means every installation can be interrupted without mass casualty if warning windows are precise and transport assumptions are accurate. Hale's face changed. Not because she had not understood the argument. Because she had. You're talking about strikes, she said. Yes. The classification was
Admiral
wrong.
Soren first,
Retaliation
because he was the
as a
least
category
patient
and the most disciplined about
priority.
disguising impatience as efficiency. Pattern
General
later.
Park next,
Damage is
broad-shouldered and silent.
This sequence did
One
not
hand
behave
flat
that
on
way.
the table as
This
though he were
sequence
already
behaved like
anchoring
correction.
himself against whatever
Tessa
the
pulled
next
a
hour
second
might
file
require.
said.
Director
Dominion
Hale
corridor
took the
policy
last
chair with a
proposals
brittle
over the
exactness of
5
someone
years.
who had spent her
Public
life in
and
rooms where
semi-public
words still
only.
held legal force
Hegemony
and was now
intelligence
being
had
asked
more
to stand
restricted
near a man who
collections
looked
available,
increasingly
of course,
like he had
but
moved
she
beyond
preferred
needing
beginning
legal
where
force
lies
to
were
get
most
what he
carefully
wanted.
dressed.
Rowan
Public
remained by the
documents
side
often
terminal with his
revealed
pad
more
in
through
hand.
phrasing than
Marcus did
classified
not
ones
sit
did through content.
He stood at the wall
Most of the
display with the
proposals
maps
were
open in
useless.
layers. Procedural
Corridor
noise.
territory,
Neutral
fuel
state
dependencies,
recommendations
logistics
designed
routes,
never to be
civilian
adopted.
staffing matrices,
Trade balancing
escort
language
patterns.
from governments
The
too
KEF
small to
network
enforce
spread
what they
across the
suggested.
screen in precise
Then she
luminous
found the
lines,
human packet.
elegant in the
Not
way
because it was
systems
built
hidden.
for long expansion
Because no one
often
had
were.
bothered to
Efficient.
prioritize it.
Scalable.
UA corridor
And humanly
stabilization
patient.
proposal.
Marcus
Envoy
looked at it
alien
without
veil.
expression.
Draft summary.
Then he said,
Tessa
they
opened
executed a diplomatic
first
envoy
page.
during a
Then the
declared
second.
public proceeding
Then
on an
sat
open
forward
civil
so quickly
frequency.
her chair wheels
Director
clicked against
Hale
the
began
floor seam.
reflexively.
There it is,
The
she
assembly
thought.
is preparing
Not a
a
full
condemnation
thought.
package.
A sensation first.
Marcus
The
cut across
prickling,
her without
almost
raising his
physical
voice.
awareness that came
I am
when
aware of
scattered
what
lines
condemnation
abruptly
began
like.
recognizing each
The
other.
room went still.
She opened the
Not
long
because the
version.
words were harsh.
Read more.
Because they were
The
not.
document was dense,
They were too flat to
carefully
qualify
argued,
as harsh.
and
They had
uncharacteristically
the
free
clean,
of the moral
load-bearing
vanity
quality
that
of a
usually
statement that
infected
had already
human
passed
diplomatic
through
writing
anger
when
and
it
arrived
addressed
somewhere
species
colder.
the assembly
Hale
disapproved
closed
of.
her mouth.
Alien Vale's
Marcus
language was
touched the
technical
first
where it
installation
needed to
on the
be
map.
technical.
A
Logistics
logistics
hub
hub
near
near
the
the
corridor
corridor
seam.
cheap,
And,
fuel storage,
most interestingly,
civilian maintenance
structured
crews,
around infrastructure
secondary
before
escort
ideology.
traffic, shared
Their
corridors,
expansion spine runs through 17
demilitarization
major
buffers,
infrastructure
resource
sites,
transparency,
he said. Not
17
military
key
command
installations
nodes, requiring
not
military
population
withdrawal
centers,
as a condition
not
of durable
symbolic targets.
stability.
Tessa
Throughput
froze.
architecture.
Then she split
Soren
the
leaned
display.
forward slightly.
Proposal on the
You're
left.
talking about pressure
Strike
points.
map on the right.
No,
Installation
Marcus
list
said.
beneath both.
I'm talking about
Her eyes
syntax.
moved once down the left
For half
column.
a second no one answered.
Once down the right.
Marcus
Then
turned
again
from the wall
slower.
and crossed to the
Her
desk.
mouth opened slightly.
He picked up one of the
Not from
folders
shock,
Rowan had laid
from
there earlier
confirmation.
and opened it to
The
a
6
clipped printout
installations
from
Marcus
Alien's Vale
proposal
had
packet.
already destroyed
He
were
set
not
the pages on the
approximately
table
aligned
in
with
front of
Alien
Park and
Vale's
Hale.
treaty proposal.
Director Hale
They were
looked down
exact.
first.
Not
Her
6
eyes
similar
moved
nodes.
across the opening
Not
section.
6 strategically
lower.
adjacent options
Then back
among
upward.
dozens. Slower
The
this
same
time
6.
as recognition
In the same
assembled.
structural logic.
These are
The same
demilitarization
spine.
terms.
For
She
several
said.
seconds Tessa
Yes.
did not move at all.
Park reached for the next
Then she
page.
stood up because
Resource
sometimes the
sharing
body
architecture.
required physical
Corridor
participation when the
oversight.
mind crossed from
Installation
uncertainty
list.
into
He
understanding.
looked up.
She crossed
These
the office
17.
once and back.
Marcus
Sat
inclined
again.
his head once.
Pulled the next 3 strike
Soren's gaze
reports.
sharpened. Compared
You
them
think
to
he
the
used the
remaining
same map?
11 proposed
Marcus looked at
demilitarization
him.
sites. He spent
A
3
cold
years
sensation
building the
entered
correct
her
one.
hands.
Silence
Not fear
followed
exactly.
that. Not because the
Professional
room
recognition
disagreed.
at a scale
Because
large
agreement
enough to
when it
resemble
arrived
fear from
was
nearby.
unpleasant.
He
Marcus
isn't
returned
making
to the
war,
wall
she
display.
said to the empty room.
They have mistaken
The room,
diplomatic
having no
language
opinion,
for optional
remained
language,
office-shaped
he
and
said.
silent.
That mistake
Tessa
survives
enlarged the
because
proposal
nothing has
language.
forced a revision.
One line in particular.
Hale let out one breath.
Shared peace
careful and
requires
thin.
shared interruption
General,
of force
with respect,
projection.
if you are suggesting
looked back at
unilateral
the strike
military
map.
action in direct
Marcus
response
Vale was
to a
not
public
avenging his
execution
brother
during
in
an
the
open
usual
diplomatic
sense.
process.
If he had been,
the
the
assembly
campaign
would
would
have
require
required consultation
consultation
across.
Leaders.
The
Visible
assembly,
authority.
Marcus said,
Population
has had 9
pain
attempts at
calibrated
formal
to produce
engagement
maximal
returned,
outrage.
ignored, or
That was
left
how
unopened.
grief often behaved
This is
when
not
given
a
fleets.
consultation deficit.
But this was not grief
It is a
left alone with
consequence
fleets.
deficit. This was
Hale
grief
stared
placed
at
under
him.
discipline
Park
and
said
handed
quietly,
a blueprint. Marcus had taken
That was the
Alien's
first time
rejected
anyone in the
treaty
room
and
had
begun
used his
building
name,
it with orbital
not
fire.
rank,
Not
title,
asking the Dominion
name.
to
It
demilitarize
landed
the
and stayed
corridor.
there.
Marcus did not react. Park continued, "What exactly are you proposing?" Marcus picked up a sheet from the desk and handed it to Rowan. "Read the staffing line." Rowan looked down. The installation file was dry, technical, stripped of everything except what systems required in order to function. He read the relevant section aloud. Station KE7. Civilian logistics personnel, 312. Military support staff, 62. Fuel reserves, maintenance systems, cargo automation. Marcus nodded once. Now read the evacuation capacity. Rowan found it. Full personnel clearance window, assuming uninterrupted transport lanes. 32 to 40 minutes. Marcus turned back to the room. They built their corridor expansion on dual-use infrastructure. Civilian visibility, military function. That means every installation can be interrupted without mass casualty if warning windows are precise and transport assumptions are accurate. Hale's face changed. Not because she had not understood the argument. Because she had. "You're talking about strikes," she said. "Yes." They
Making
sat.
continued militarization impossible
because he was the least
he wasn't
patient
destroying
and the
the
most
proposal.
disciplined about
He was
disguising
removing
impatience
the
as
refusal
efficiency.
around it. General
Tessa
Park
sat very
next,
still.
broad-shouldered
That
and
was what
silent.
frightened her.
One hand
Not
flat
the
on the
destruction,
table as though he were
the
already
coherence.
anchoring himself
She
against
opened a
whatever the
private
next
notes
hour
file.
might require.
Not official
Director
analysis.
Hale took the
Not
last
yet,
chair
just
with the
the
brittle
brittle
exactness
exactness
she
of
used
someone
when
who
a
had
pattern
spent
was
her
still
life in
becoming
rooms
language.
where words still
For
held
several
legal
seconds
force
she
and
was
looked
now
at the
being
blank
asked to
field.
stand near a
Then
man
she
who looked
typed.
increasingly
The
like
human
he had
general
moved
is
beyond
not
needing
conducting
legal
a
force to get what he wanted.
retaliatory campaign.
Rowan
He is constructing
remaining
a
the
negotiated
negotiated
outcome
outcome
by
by
force.
hand.
Marcus did not sit. Reread it.
He stood at
Too
the wall
broad.
display with the
Too
maps
abstract.
open in layers.
She deleted
Corridor
half of it and
territory,
began again.
fuel dependencies,
The target
logistics
sequence
routes,
corresponds
civilian
exactly to
staffing
envoy
matrices,
Alien Vale's
escort
previously
patterns.
rejected
The
corridor
Keth network spread
demilitarization
across
framework.
the screen in precise
The military
luminous
action
lines,
should be read not
elegant
as
in the way
conventional
systems built for
retaliation,
long expansion
but as
often
coerced
were.
implementation
Efficient,
of prior
scalable,
diplomatic architecture.
and humanly patient.
Better.
Marcus
Not
looked
complete.
at it without
She
expression.
kept going.
Then he
Observed
said,
objective
they
is not
executed a
maximal
diplomatic
damage.
envoy during
Observed
a declared
objective
public
is removal
proceeding
of
on
dominion
open
operational
frequency.
ability within
Director
disputed
Hale
corridor
began
while preserving
reflexively,
civilian
the
life
Assembly
and
is
public
preparing
record
a condemnation
legitimacy.
package and
Conclusion.
Marcus cut across her
Marcus
without
Vale is
raising
not
his
attempting
voice.
to win a war
I am
in the
aware of
standard
what
sense.
condemnation looks
He
like.
is making Alien
The
Vale's
room went
treaty the
still,
only remaining
not because
shape
the
the
words
corridor
were
can
harsh,
take.
because
She
they were
leaned
not.
back. They were
Read the
too
line
flat
twice.
to qualify as
Left it.
harsh. That they
She
had
thought
clean,
is the sentence.
load-bearing quality of a
Outside
statement
Office
that had
14
already
Blue,
passed through
the
anger and
hegemony
arrived
station
somewhere
continued
colder.
its administrative
Hale
day
closed
with
her mouth.
perfect indifference.
Marcus touched the
Messaging
first
clerks
installation
moved
on the
packets
map.
between
A
departments.
logistics hub near the
Someone
corridor
laughed in
seam.
the corridor
Fuel
at a joke
storage.
too weak to survive
Civilian
retelling.
maintenance crews.
A food trolley
Secondary
passed with
escort
insulated
traffic.
trays no one
Their
would remember an
expansion
hour
spine
later.
runs through
Somewhere
17
in the
major
building, 3
infrastructure
senior
sites,
officials
he
were
said.
probably still
Not
insisting
military
publicly
command
that the
nodes.
hegemony had
Not
never materially
population
supported
centers.
Keth
Not
logistics growth
symbolic
in a way that
targets.
meaningfully altered
Throughput
corridor
architecture.
power balance.
Soren leaned
Tessa looked
forward
at the
slightly.
support contract
You're
file
talking
she had
about
not
pressure
meant to
points.
open yet.
No,
Then opened it.
Marcus said. There they were.
I'm talking
4
about
years
syntax.
of infrastructure tenders
For half a
routed
second,
through
no one
subsidiaries
answered.
and neutral
Marcus
service
turned from the
arrays.
wall and crossed to the
Maintenance
desk.
scaffolds.
He picked up one of
Relay
the folders
calibration.
Rowan had laid there
Fuel
earlier and
containment
opened it to a
licensing.
clipped printout
Not
from
military
Alien's
on
proposal
paper.
packet.
In reality,
He set the pages on the
exact
table
kind of
in front
quiet
of Park
support
and
and
aggressive
Hale.
systems
Director
depended
Hale
on in order
down
to
first.
continue pretending
Her
their
eyes
expansion
moved
was
across
merely
the opening
efficient
section.
administration.
Then lower.
She closed the
Then
file.
back upward.
Opened it
Slower
again.
this time as
Cross-referenced the
recognition
contracts
assembled.
with the first
These
6
are
destroyed
demilitarization
installations.
terms, she
3
said.
direct overlaps.
Yes.
Too probable.
Park reached for the next
One
page.
hidden behind a
Resource
layered
sharing
holding structure
architecture.
so transparent
Corridor
and
audit
intent it
oversight.
practically waved.
Installation
Tessa
list.
exhaled
He
slowly.
looked up.
The
These
problem had
17.
just widened. Marcus
Not
inclined his
analytically.
head once.
Politically.
Soren's
There
gaze
are
sharpened.
moments in intelligence
You think
work
he used
when a
the
pattern
same map?
stops being interesting
Marcus
and
looked
becomes
at him.
expensive.
He spent
This was
3
one of
years
them.
building the
She
correct
pulled a
one.
classified
Silence
report
followed
template.
that.
Max
Not because the
sensitivity.
room disagreed.
Restricted distribution.
Because agreement, when it
Then
arrived,
paused.
was unpleasant.
Because something else had
Marcus
begun
returned
troubling
to
her
the
now
wall
that the
display.
broader structure
They
had
have
clarified.
mistaken diplomatic
The
language
warnings.
for optional
She
language.
reopened the
he
public
said.
transmission
That
logs
mistake
from
survives
K7.
because nothing
Then
has forced a
K12.
revision.
Then K3.
Hale let out one breath,
All of them
careful
delivered
and
in
thin.
formal CAF.
General, with
Not
respect,
machine clean
if you are
CAF.
suggesting
Not
unilateral
generic
military
diplomatic
action
register.
in direct response
Specific.
to a public execution during an
Weighted.
open diplomatic
A linguistic
process,
specialist
the
had
Assembly
already
will
noted
require
this in the
consultation
metadata,
across,
but buried it
the
under
Assembly,
routine technical
Marcus said,
phrasing.
has had 9
Tessa read
attempts
it
at
again
formal
more carefully.
engagement returned,
Warning cadence
ignored, or
displays
left
repeated
unopened.
structural
This
resemblance
is not
to
a consultation
archived speech
patterns
patterns
used by envoy
It is a
Alien
consequence
Vale and
deficit.
high-formality exchanges.
Hale stared at him.
She went very
Park
still.
said quietly,
Then pulled the
Marcus.
archived recordings.
That was the first time
Alien
anyone
in
in the room
public
had
briefings.
used his name.
Alien in
Not
corridor
rank.
negotiations.
Not title.
Alien
Name.
in
It
testimony
landed
before
and stayed
assembly
there.
review. Marcus
Then
did not
Marcus's
react.
warnings.
Park continued. What exactly are you proposing? Marcus picked up a sheet from the desk and handed it to Rowan. Read the staffing line. Rowan looked down. The installation file was dry, technical, stripped of everything except what systems required in order to function. He read the relevant section aloud. Station KE7. Civilian logistics personnel, 312. Military support staff, 62. Fuel reserves, maintenance systems, cargo automation. Marcus nodded once. Now read the evacuation capacity. Rowan found it. Full personnel clearance window, assuming uninterrupted transport lanes, 32
32 to 40 minutes. Marcus turned back to the room. They built their corridor expansion on dual-use infrastructure. Civilian visibility, military function. That means every installation can be interrupted without mass casualty if warning windows are precise and transport assumptions are accurate. Hale's face changed. Not because she had not understood the argument. Because she had. You're talking about strikes, she said. Yes. They sat by side. Admiral Soren
same
first
formal
because he was the
architecture,
least patient
not
and the most
identical.
disciplined about
Marcus's
disguising
voice was
impatience as
harder,
efficiency.
flatter,
carrying
General
authority
Park
where
next,
aliens carried
broad-shouldered and
invitation.
silent.
But the
One hand
sentence
flat on the
design,
table,
the
as though
layered
he were already
imperative
anchoring
sequencing,
himself
the
against
courtesy
whatever the
markers
next hour
embedded
might
inside
require.
final instruction.
Director Hale
Those
took the
were too
last
close
chair
to
with
be
the brittle
incidental.
exactness of
Tessa
someone who had
understood
spent
at
her
once.
life in rooms
The
where
warnings
words
were
still
not
held
simply
legal
warnings,
force and was now
they
being
were
asked to stand
continuation.
near a man who looked
Marcus had learned to
increasingly like
speak
he
to
had
the
moved
Keth in his
beyond
brother's
needing legal
register
force
for
to
the
get
only
what he
part of
wanted.
the campaign that
Rowan
directly
remained by
addressed
the
the
side
side terminal
civilians.
with his pad in
Get
hand.
out.
Marcus did not sit. This is final.
He stood at the wall
strikes were
display with the
Marcus.
maps open
The
in
warnings
layers.
were aliens still
Corridor
being allowed to
territory,
speak.
fuel dependencies,
Tessa took her
logistics
hands off the
routes,
desk,
civilian
folded
staffing
them once in
matrices,
her lap,
escort patterns.
waited for the insight to settle into its correct shape before naming it.
luminous lines.
When it finally arrived,
elegant in the way
he did
systems
so with the
built for long
clean force of an
expansion
equation
often work.
balancing, efficient.
He finished his
scalable,
brother's sentence,
inhumanly
she thought.
patient.
Then, because
Marcus
private
looked at it
thoughts
without
did not
expression.
survive bureaucracies
Then he
unless
said,
written down
they
somewhere
executed
first.
a
She opened the
diplomatic
scratch
envoy
file
during
again
an
and
declared
typed.
public proceeding
Marcus
on an
Vale did
open
not
civil
separate war
frequency.
from
diplomacy.
Director Hale
He
began
fused them.
reflexively.
Every strike
The
is the
Assembly
military
is
half
preparing
of
a
an
condemnation
argument.
package.
Every warning is the
Marcus cut
diplomatic
across
half.
her without
She
raising
stared
his
at the
voice.
line.
I
Then
am
added
aware
one
of
more
what
condemnation
beneath it.
looks like.
He finished his
The
brother's
room went
sentence.
still. He just
Not because
changed
the
the
words
grammar.
were harsh.
This time
Because
she
they
did
were
not
not.
edit. They
She
were
knew
too
when
flat
language
to
had
qualify
arrived
as
at the right
harsh.
pressure.
They had the
At
clean,
16
load-bearing
station
quality
time,
of a
she
statement
transmitted
that had
the
already
formal
passed through
analysis
anger
up the
and
restricted
arrived somewhere
chain.
colder.
It would go
Hale
first to
closed her
mid-level
mouth.
strategic review,
Marcus touched
then
the first
probably stall for
installation on the
6
map.
hours in the
A
office of someone
logistics
who
hub near the
disliked
corridor
implications
scene.
he had not
Fuel
personally
storage.
discovered,
Civilian
then moved to
maintenance
external
crews.
affairs, where
Secondary
two different
escort
officials would
traffic.
likely try to
Their
soften the
expansion
wording.
spine
Then,
runs
if the
through
universe was
17
briefly
major
merciful,
infrastructure sites,
reach a
he
person
said.
with enough authority
Not
and
military
enough fear
command
to
notes.
understand that the
Not
hegemony's
population
current posture
centers.
toward humanity
Not
was now
symbolic
operating
targets.
on expired
Throughput
assumptions.
architecture.
That was the official
Soren
path.
leaned forward
Tessa
slightly.
prepared a second
You're
path
talking
too.
about pressure
Not
points.
illegal.
No,
Not entirely
Marcus
proper.
said. A
I'm
controlled
talking
leak
about
package.
syntax. Sanitized
For half a
enough to
second, no one
survive
answered.
circulation.
Marcus
Sharp
turned
enough
from the
to do
wall and
damage
crossed
where
to the
needed.
desk. Support
He picked
contracts.
up one of the folders
Strike
Rowan had
sequence
laid there
logic.
earlier and opened it to a clipped
Demilitarization
printout
overlap.
from Alien's
The
proposal
line
packet.
about the treaty being
He
built
set the
under
pages
fire
on the
omitted
table
from
in
the
front of
document,
Park
but
and Hale.
obvious to anyone
Director Hale
intelligent
did
enough
not
to
first.
deserve reading them.
Her eyes moved
She
across
assembled
the
it
opening
quietly.
section.
Not
Then
because she
lower.
was disloyal.
Then back up
because she had spent
Slower
19
this
years
time as
watching
recognition
governments wait
assembled.
too long to
These are
recognize when the shape of a
demilitarization
situation
terms,
had
she
changed.
said.
Delays,
Yes.
she had learned,
Park
was
reached for the
often
next
just
page.
vanity-wearing
Resource
procedure as a
sharing
mask.
architecture. By the
Corridor
time she
audit
locked the
oversight.
file and transmitted
Installation
the first
list.
official report,
He looked up.
the ninth installation had
17.
gone dark on the corridor
Marcus
map.
inclined his head
Half
once.
the spine was dead now.
Soren's gaze
Half the
sharpened.
pressure removed.
You think he used the
and
same
still
map.
the campaign had not
Marcus
widened.
looked at him. That mattered too.
He spent 3 years
Marcus could
building
have
the
made the
correct
galaxy
one.
afraid of
Silence
what humanity
followed
might
that.
do when enraged.
Not because the room
Instead,
disagreed.
he was teaching it something
because
colder
agreement
and
when
more
it
durable.
arrived was
What
unpleasant.
humanity would do when it
Marcus
had
returned
already
to the
asked
wall
properly
display.
and been answered
They have
respectful.
mistaken diplomatic
Tessa
language
stood
for
and crossed
optional
the room
language,
to the
he
recess
said.
shelf.
That
Where a
mistake
kettle
survives
survives
because
because
nothing
she
has
almost
forced a
never
revision.
used.
She
Hale
let
filled
out
one.
one breath,
Forgot
careful
about
and
it.
thin.
By the time
General,
she
with
returned to her
respect,
desk,
if you are
it had
suggesting
already
unilateral
begun
military
cooling.
action in
She
direct
looked at the
response to a
public
public
summary from the
execution
latest
during an
strike.
open diplomatic
Evacuation
process.
confirmed.
The Assembly will
No
require
civilian
consultation
casualties.
across.
Infrastructure
The Assembly,
collapse total.
Marcus said,
Dominion
has had 9
expansion
attempts
traffic
at formal
reduced another
engagement
measurable
returned,
percentage.
ignored, or left
The words were
unopened.
dry.
This
The
is
reality
not a
consultation
consultation
was
deficit.
not. It is
She
a
sat down
consequence
again,
deficit.
opened a personal log
Hale stared at
unconnected
him.
to any official
Park
channel,
said quietly,
and wrote the
Marcus.
sentence she suspected
That was
she
the
would
first
remember
time
long
anyone in
after
the room
committee
had used
language
his
and
name.
strategic
Not
summaries
rank,
had blurred into the
not
usual
title.
sludge of
Name.
institutional
It
memory.
landed and stayed there.
Humanity sent
Marcus
a man
did
who
not
believed in
react.
words. Park
Then they
continued,
sent a man who
what
knew
exactly
what words
are you
cost.
proposing?
She read it
Marcus
once.
picked up a
Then
sheet from the
closed the
desk
file
and
and
handed
went
it
back
back
to
to
Rowan.
work. Because
Read the
elsewhere in the
staffing
corridor,
line.
in offices
Rowan
much
looked
larger
down.
and minds
The
much
installation
slower,
file was
people were
dry,
only just beginning to
technical,
realize that
stripped of
Marcus
everything
Vale had
except
not
what
answered the
systems
Keth
required in
execution
order
with
to
rage.
function.
He
had
read the
answered it with
relevant
proof.
section aloud.
And proof, once
Station
arranged
KE7
correctly, was much
civilian
harder to
logistics
negotiate with than
personnel,
grief.
312.
The Keth requested a
military
ceasefire on the
support
47th day.
62.
They did not call it surrender.
Reserves, maintenance
Civilizations
systems,
rarely
cargo
did,
automation.
not while enough
Marcus
language remained
nodded once.
available to delay
Now
honesty
read the
by one more
evacuation
document.
capacity.
Rowan found it. Full personnel clearance window, assuming uninterrupted transport lanes, 32 to 40 minutes. Marcus turned back to the room. They built their corridor expansion on dual-use infrastructure. Civilian visibility, military function. That means every installation can be interrupted without mass casualty if warning windows are precise and transport assumptions are accurate. Hale's face changed. Not because she had not understood the argument. Because she had. You're talking about strikes, she said. Yes. The request arrived through three channels within the span of 6 minutes. Patient and the most disciplined about disguising impatience as a frequency in exact general procedural format. Broad-shouldered then through a neutral relay belonging to the Voron Collective, as though he were already entire foreign policy against whatever the next hour with only minor unfairness. Director Hale took the last chair to remember us as having seen someone who had spent her life in rooms where words still held legal force. The third came directly to the United Earth Assembly near a man who looked increasingly like he had no personal reference anywhere in the text to Marcus Vale. Rowan remained by his side terminal with his pad in hand. That omission was noted immediately by every human official who read the wall display with the maps commented on by none of them. Corridor territory, fuel dependencies, the Keth convocation still civilian not to name the man who had dismantled their corridor spine. The Keth network spread across the screen in precise luminous lines. Naming him directly elegant in the way systems built for long legitimate counterpart. The Keth were not yet willing to do that, even now with 14 of the 17 structural nodes gone and their territorial expansion stalled so completely that diplomatic envoy during a declared public proceeding on an open civil fire request was elegant. Director Hale began reflexively. Procedurally exact. The Assembly is preparing a condemnation suspension of hostilities to allow Crosser without raising his voice to resume under recognized intercivilizational conflict standards. The room went still. It referenced public not because concern. The words were harsh. Corridor stability. Because they were not. Mutual benefit. They were too flat to qualify as future order. They had the clean, load-bearing quality of a statement that had already passed through anger and arrived somewhere colder. It did not reference the 9 unanswered human requests for dialogue preceding the first installation on the map. It behaved, in other words, hub near like a government attempting to begin history at the point most convenient to its current discomfort. Secondary escort traffic. Rowan read the request once at the outer terminal, spine runs then through 17 major infrastructure office, he said. Marcus was standing at the display wall with the corridor map population centers. Diminished not state. Symbolic targets. 14 dead installations. Throughput architecture. 3 remaining. Soren leaned forward. The surviving Keth infrastructure glowed in a narrowing arc across the disputed Marcus zone. Said. No longer I'm talking about frontier of confident expansion. For half a second, but no as a damaged system trying Marcus very hard from the wall and still remembered the shape of its own momentum. He picked up one of the folders Rowan had laid there earlier and opened it to a clipped printout from Alien's proposal packet. Then handed it back. He set the pages on the table in front of Park and Hale. Only Director after several seconds, with his attention already back on the wall display, opening section. Did he say, then tell them we'll speak then when the last 3 are addressed. Slower this time Rowan as recognition assembled. Not because he doubted he had demilitarization terms, because the sentence, for all its calm, Park carried the exact density of a resource sharing already selected. Corridor audit oversight, he said. Installation to leave. Behind him, Marcus said, these 17 use their public language. Marcus inclined his head once. Rowan looked back. Soren's gaze Marcus did not. You think they started the record in public? Marcus looked at him. We'll continue. He spent 3 years building the reply went out 12 minutes silence later. Followed that. Keth formal register. Not because the room disagreed. Human translation because agreement when no retort was unpleasant. Dialogue Marcus returned to the wall demilitarization. They have mistaken diplomatic language for optional language. Address them. That mistake survives the Assembly objected within the hour. Hale let out one breath, careful. That would have been too efficient. General, 7 messages from 5 departments. If you are suggesting unilateral military action and direct response to a public execution during an open diplomatic process, 3 different legal memoranda require consultation in slightly different language. The Assembly to discover whether the phrase addressed has had 9 attempted at formal engagement returned, Marcus ignored or left unopened. The Secretary General's office sent a more direct note. It is a consequence deficit. Carefully stared at him. Infuriated beneath the polish. Marcus. Rowan summarized that was the first time anyone in the room had used his name. Marcus read the summary. Not title. No questions. Name. Returned to the map. And stayed there. By then, Marcus knew the pattern well enough to feel, with a kind of administrative fatalism, that institutions could continue throwing language at the situation for as long as they liked. Read the staffing line. But unless that language altered corridor geometry, the installation file was dry, under noise. Technical. The 15th installation fell on systems required in order to function. The 16th on day 63. He read the relevant section both aloud. With warning. Station both K7. With full evacuation. Civilian logistics personnel, 312. Military support staff, 62. Fuel reserves, maintenance systems, cargo automation. Marcus nodded once. Now read the evacuation capacity. Rowan found it. Full personnel clearance window, assuming uninterrupted transport lanes, 32 to 40 minutes. Marcus turned back to the room. They built their corridor expansion on dual-use infrastructure. Civilian visibility, military function. That means every installation can be interrupted without mass casualty if warning windows are precise and transport assumptions are accurate. Hale's face changed. Not because she had not understood the argument. Because she had. You're talking about strikes, she said. Yes.
Rowan knew he had known because the staffing model
because he was the
Marcus's
least patient
from
and
the
the most
night before had
disciplined
a
about
single
disguising
notation in the margins
impatience
beside the
efficiency.
evacuation
General
estimate.
Park next,
At 12 shouldered and silent.
Lower crew
One
exits
hand
blind.
flat on the table
The
as though
warning
he
went
were
out
already
in formal
anchoring
cast on
himself
the public
against whatever
channel.
the next hour
The
might
same voice.
require.
The same
Director Hale
structure.
took the last
The
chair
same
with the
terrible
brittle
courtesy.
exactness of someone
When the
who had
last
spent her
personnel
life in
cluster
rooms where
cleared
words
and the
still held
installation
legal
disappeared
force and
into
was
light
now
and
being
debris,
asked to stand near
the
a man
disputed
who looked
corridor
increasingly
stopped
like he
behaving
had
like a
moved
kept
beyond
frontier
needing legal
altogether.
force to get what he
It
wanted.
became, instead,
Rowan remained
exactly
by the
what
side
Alien's
terminal with his
proposal
pad
had
and
argued
argued
it
should
should
become
Marcus
from the
did
beginning.
not sit.
A region in which
the
a
wall
wall
display
projection
with
had
the
been
maps
interrupted
opened in
enough
layers.
to make
Corridor
negotiations
territory
structurally fuel
unavoidable.
dependencies,
4
logistics
hours later,
routes,
the Keth
civilian
sent one
staffing
line.
matrices,
No tonal
escort
layering.
patterns.
No
The
high
Keth
register.
network spread across
No
the screen in
institutional
precise
theater.
luminous lines,
Just plain
elegant
practical
in the way
Keth
systems
translated
built for long
cleanly into
expansion
standard.
often were.
We will discuss
Efficient.
terms. Scalable.
Rowan brought the
and
message
humanly
in.
patient. Marcus read it,
looked at it
set
without
it down
expression.
parallel to the edge
Then
of
he
the
said,
desk.
they
Looked at
executed a
Rowan.
diplomatic
Tell them
envoy
we'll
during
come
a
to them.
declared public
Standard
proceeding on an
diplomatic
open civil
transport.
frequency.
3 days.
Director Hale
Rowan
began
sent the
reflexively.
acceptance.
The assembly
reply
is
came back
preparing
in
a
40
condemnation
minutes.
package and
Agreed.
that
Marcus
was how
cut across her
empires
without
sound
raising
when they
his
finally
voice.
understood the
I am
difference
aware of
between
what
refusal
condemnation
and
looks like.
impossibility.
The
room went
assembly
still.
objected again,
Not
naturally,
because the words were harsh,
not to the meeting
because
itself,
they were not.
to the shape
They were
of it.
too flat to qualify
Standard
as
surrender
harsh.
protocol
They had the
required a
clean,
diplomatic
load-bearing
team,
quality of a
civilian
statement that had
oversight,
already passed
committee
through anger and
attendance,
arrived somewhere
a visible
colder.
performance
Hale
of collective
closed her mouth.
authority.
Marcus
touched
listened
the
to
first
exactly 1
installation on the
minute
map.
and 19
A
seconds of the
logistics
Secretary
hub near the
General's
corridor
aide
scene.
explaining this on
Fuel
secure
storage.
channel before saying,
Civilian
I
maintenance
know what
crews.
standard procedure
Secondary
is.
escort
He
traffic.
terminated the call
Their
himself.
expansion spine
Then he
runs
looked
through
at Rowan.
17 major
You're going.
infrastructure sites.
It was
he
not
said.
phrased as
Not
invitation.
military command
Rowan
nodes.
blinked once.
Not population
Sir?
centers.
Not
Documentation.
symbolic targets.
Sequence control.
Throughput architecture.
Record.
Yes,
Soren
sir.
leaned forward slightly.
Marcus paused.
You're talking
For the
about
first time
pressure
in weeks,
points?
something like surprise
No,
touched his
Marcus
face.
said.
Very
I'm
lightly,
talking
very
about
briefly,
syntax.
because Rowan
For
did
half
not
a second, no
immediately
one
leave.
answered.
Instead,
Marcus
Rowan
turned
said,
from the wall
"Do you
and
want me
crossed
with
to the
you?"
desk. A small
He
question.
picked up one of the folders
Practical
Rowan
in
had
one
laid there
sense.
earlier and
Not
opened it to a
practical at
clipped
all in
printout
another.
from Alien's
Marcus
proposal
looked at
packet.
him properly then.
He set the pages on the
office was
table
quiet
in front
enough
of
that
Park
Rowan
and
could
Hale.
hear the station air
Director Hale
system
looked
cycling
down
behind
first.
the walls.
Her eyes moved
Yes,
across
Marcus
the opening
said.
section.
That was all.
Then lower.
It was enough.
Then back
The
upward.
negotiation
Slower
station
this
sat
time
in the
as
disputed
recognition
corridor,
assembled.
not on
These are
Prime.
demilitarization
Smaller.
terms, she
Secondary.
said.
Yes.
Functionally neutral
Park
in the
reached
way
for the
places
next
became
page.
neutral after
Resource
enough
sharing
power had
architecture.
passed near them to make
Corridor
anyone's
audit
home
oversight.
territory politically
Installation
inconvenient.
list.
Marcus
looked up.
noticed the choice
These
immediately
17.
when their transport
Marcus
docked at
inclined his head
1,400
once.
station time.
Soren's gaze sharpened.
Not the station itself.
You think
at
he
first.
used the same map?
The message carried
Marcus
by it.
looked at him.
The Keth had not
He spent
invited
3 years
humanity
building
into the
the
chamber
correct
where
one.
Alien died.
Silence followed
They
that.
had selected a
Not
different
because
room.
the room disagreed.
Smaller scale.
Because
Lower
agreement
stakes
when
in
it
appearance.
arrived was
No
unpleasant.
public architecture
Marcus
of
returned
dominance.
to the wall display.
Not remorse, Marcus
They have
thought.
mistaken diplomatic
Adaptation.
language for
The
optional
docking bay
language,
reception
he said.
confirmed this. That mistake
Protocol
survives
officers,
because
not
nothing has
guards.
forced a revision.
Formal bands at the
Hale
shoulder
let out
joints.
one breath, careful
No weapons
and thin.
displayed.
General,
Skin
with
colors
respect,
held
if
in
you are
careful
suggesting
low-motion
unilateral
control.
military action
Marcus
in
stepped
direct
off the
response toward
transport
public
first.
execution
Rowan
during
one
an open
pace behind
diplomatic
him.
process.
2
The
documentation
assembly will
officers
require
behind Rowan,
consultation across.
present in the exact
The
human
assembly,
military way
Marcus
that
said,
signaled
has
official
had 9
witness
attempts
without
at
pretending
formal
to be
engagement
anything more
returned,
important than
ignored,
that.
or left
The Keth
unopened.
protocol lead
This is
inclined
not
its
a
head.
consultation
General
deficit.
Marcus Vale.
It is a consequence
received.
deficit.
Hale stared at him. Park said quietly, Marcus. That was the first time anyone in the room had used his name. Not rank. Not title. Name. It landed and stayed there. Marcus did not react. Park continued, What exactly are you proposing? Marcus picked up a sheet from the desk and handed it to Rowan. Read the staffing line. Rowan looked down. The installation file was dry, technical, stripped of everything except what systems required in order to function. He read the relevant section aloud. Station KE7. Civilian logistics personnel, 312. Military support staff, 62. Fuel reserves, maintenance systems, cargo automation. Marcus nodded once. Now read the evacuation capacity. Rowan found it. Full personnel clearance window, assuming uninterrupted transport lanes, 32 to 40 minutes. Marcus turned back to the room. They built their corridor expansion on dual-use infrastructure. Civilian visibility, military function. That means every installation can be interrupted without mass casualty if warning windows are precise and transport assumptions are accurate. Hale's face changed. Not because she had not understood the argument. Because she had. You're talking about strikes, she said. Yes. Marcus answered in Admiral Soren first because he was the least patient and the most disciplined about disguising impatience as narrower than those in Elian's briefing notes from the broad-shouldered and silent. Different pulse rate flat on the table as though he were already anchoring himself against whatever elevated environmental register. Director Hale took the last chair with the brutal exactness of someone who had spent her life in rooms where words months around Marcus and weeks was now being asked to stand near a man who looked increasingly like he had moved beyond details legal force to get what he wanted. Lower light. Rowan remained by the side terminal with his pad in hand. No ceremonial displays in corridor approach. He stood at the wall minimizing the maps open in layers. That was corridor wise. Territory, the negotiation chamber logistics routes, civilian staffing matrices, escort patterns. 4 chairs on each side. The Keth network spread across the screen in precise circular center floor. Elegant in the way systems to make the arriving delegation feel physically reduced. Efficient. Either the Keth had built the room specifically for this purpose, Marcus looked at it without expression, because nothing in it reminded anyone too strongly of the diplomatic envoy during a declared public proceeding on an open civil frequency. Rowan to his right. Director Hale documentation officers beyond. The Assembly is across preparing the table a condemnation package. Draven, 5 convocation members, across her without raising his voice. Third voice I am aware of what condemnation looks like. From the moment he entered. The room went still, not with hostility, not because the words were harsh. With the because they were not measuring attention of someone who had been thinking about a man for a very long time and was now checking whether the reality aligned with the architecture of the idea and arrived somewhere colder. The room settled. Closed her mouth. No one spoke for several seconds. Touched the first installation on the map. Formal logistics hub near the corridor seam. Careful enough to suggest he understood exactly what it meant now to use secondary escort traffic. Your brother believed we were capable of more. Their expansion spine runs through 17 major infrastructure sites. A long, level look that carried neither military command nor hatred. Not population centers, Marcus said. Not symbolic targets. The words remained between architecture. Then Marcus added, Soren leaned That's why we're slightly. At a table instead of talking about pressure points. No one answered immediately. Marcus said. Even Draven did not interrupt. Syntax. Perhaps because there was nothing to say against it. Marcus turned from the wall. The last 72 days had been one long education in what happened when had laid there earlier and opened his made to prove the cost of Alien's proposal package. The terms took 4 hours. He set the pages on the table because Marcus negotiated them. Director Hale formalities required that duration in order to become the opening section. Negotiation implies live adjustment. Then back upward. Mutual this time as recognition possibility not yet settled. These are demilitarization terms. Marcus presented terms the way an engineer presented load requirements after the bridge had already collapsed and the river beneath it had become inconvenient for everyone. Installation list. 17 corridor systems demilitarized. Shared resource framework enacted. Transit oversight jointly audited. You think he used the same public record amended? Marcus looked at a war crimes tribunal for the execution to be conducted by Keth judiciary. Followed not human authority, not because the room justice imposed from outside. Because agreement when it arrived was Marcus had no interest in Marcus returned to the wall near the end. One final clause. They have mistaken diplomatic language original optional language. Not in any assembly draft. That mistake survives because in Marcus's own hand on the back of a transmission sheet 3 nights earlier while Rowan slept 2 offices away and the station cycled through unilateral military action in direct response to a public execution during an open diplomatic process. Rendered it in flat, the Assembly will require consultation across. The Dominion acknowledges that the United Ark Assembly has had 9 attempts at formal engagement returned prior to the commencement of hostilities. This is not a consultation that humanity asked first. It is a consequence deficit. Followed. Not because the clause was procedurally quietly, because it was morally exact. That was the first time anyone in the room had used his name, briefly, unmistakably, not title, into a register Rowan had only ever seen in Keth Grief analysis. Marcus did not react. Draven remained very still. What exactly are you proposing? None of them picked up a sheet from the desk by now the room understood what Marcus had known from the start. Rowan looked down. The clause was not ornamental. The installation file was dry, technical, stripped of everything except what systems required in order to function. He read the relevant section aloud. Station KE7. Civilian logistics personnel, 312. Military support staff, 62. Fuel reserves, maintenance systems, cargo automation. Marcus nodded once. Now read the evacuation capacity. Rowan found it. Full personnel clearance window, assuming uninterrupted transport lanes, 32 to 40 minutes. Marcus turned back to the room. They built their corridor expansion on dual-use infrastructure. Civilian visibility, military function. That means every installation can be interrupted without mass casualty if warning windows are precise and transport assumptions are accurate. Hale's face changed. Not because she had not understood the argument. Because she had. You're talking about strikes, she said. Yes. It was the sentence around which everything else in the treaty was the least patient and the most disciplined about disguising impatience as efficiency. First.
General Park next, broad-shouldered and silent. The documents were executed. Flat on the table as though he were already anchoring himself against whatever the next hour might require. As mutual Director Hale took the last chair with the brittle exactness of someone who had spent her life in rooms where words still held legal force and was now being reached into the left inner pocket of his increasingly like he had moved beyond needing legal force to get what he wanted. Rowan realized remained by the side terminal with his pad in hand. A small reflexive motion Rowan had noticed without understanding. With the maps open in layers. Now Marcus drew something out and placed it in the center of the table between himself and Draven. Civilian staffing major translation escort patterns. Ordinary looking. The Keth network standard diplomatic and precise luminous lines. The kind of device no one in another way systems would build for long expansion often were. Rowan knew instantly what it was. Scalable. Rith knew too. Inhumanly patient. His attention dropped to it and did not leave without several seconds. Then he said, did not explain. They executed a diplomatic envoy during a declared public proceeding on an open device and continued performing its function while the chamber became a place from which language had been expelled. A condemnation he simply left it there. Marcus cut across her without raising his signed documents. I am aware of what condemnation looks like. Copies. The room protocol language was completed around them in careful low voices. Because they were not. Marcus turned and walked out. To qualify as he did not look back. They had the treaty was transmitted on the quality of a statement that had already hours later anger and arrived the same public frequency. Hale closed her family of signal through which the galaxy had watched installation on the map. A logistics hub near the corridor different language, fuel storage, corridor demilitarization, civilian maintenance crews, shared framework, secondary escort judicial inquiry. Their expansion runs through 17 major infrastructure dialogue, he said. Across stations, not military command centers and not population throughout the corridor world, not symbolic people targets. Received the message and understood architecture, each in the vocabulary available to them, slightly. That the sentence had finally been forced to its correct conclusion. No. Marcus said, exactly. I'm talking about syntax. But a table. For half a second, this time everyone in the room knew Marcus had turned from the wall and crossed to the desk. The ship back to Earth had an 11-day transit Rowan had laid there not long enough to become a clipped printout from Alien's to remain pure motion. He set the pages on the table in middle category that followed all finished campaigns. Director Hale looked down first. The space after active work across the opening section. Aftermath had fully hardened into institutions. Then back upward. Reports, slower this memorials, as recognition and the various official lies governments these are demilitarization so survive having been changed by events they had not controlled. Park reached for the next Rowan page. Handled the resource sharing architecture. There was a great deal corridor of audit oversight. The Secretary General. Installation list. The Joint Chiefs. He looked up. Diplomatic affairs. 17. The Voron Collective. Marcus inclined his messages had become noticeably warmer now that warmth no longer carried same map. Three separate neutral governments suddenly eager to discuss corridor cooperation. Silence followed. A private inquiry from the Sindari hegemony written in the brittle, polished language of a civilization trying very hard to sound as though it had always understood the importance of mistaken diplomatic language for optional language. In no way spent the previous years quietly profiting from because nothing has forced a revision. Rowan dealt with all of it. Hale let out one breath, Marcus's space clear the way he had kept it clear for 72 days of campaign, unilateral military action in direct response to a public execution during an open diplomatic process. Answered what could be answered, will require and let the rest collect in the outer systems where bureaucracy belongs. Marcus said, he has had 9 attempts at formal engagement less than should have. Ignored before the campaign. He had thought this of himself as a confrontation man in a practical role. It is a consequence sequence control. Hale stared at anticipating what a command office required in order to continue functioning. That was the first time anyone in the room had used his name. He had not expected to discover that part of his usefulness would consist of holding a perimeter around one grieving man so thoroughly that the grief could finish becoming what it needed to become without interference. Marcus understood now that from the desk had handed it to Rowan. Read the large visible burden. Rowan looked down. Not the famous one. The installation file was dry, the kind that kept the room standing while someone else listed the thing required in order to function. On the fourth day of transit, Rowan brought 2 cups of coffee to the common area, civilian logistics compartment, and found Marcus sitting alone at the table military with the corridor maps spread in front of him. The same reserves, maintenance systems, cargo automation. Marcus nodded once. Now read the evacuation capacity. Rowan found it. Full personnel clearance window, assuming uninterrupted transport lanes, 32 to 40 minutes. Marcus turned back to the room. They built their corridor expansion on dual-use infrastructure. Civilian visibility, military function. That means every installation can be interrupted without mass casualty if warning windows are precise and transport assumptions are accurate. Hale's face changed. Not because she had not understood the argument. Because she had. You're talking about strikes, she said. Yes. They not said. Identical copies. Admiral Soren first, those because he was the least patient and the most disciplined about disguising impatience as efficiency. But the same territory. General Park the next, same broad-shouldered and silent. The same lines through flat on the table as once tried to turn into policy and Marcus had whatever the next hour might require. Director Hale took the last chair resting beside the papers and the other around spent her life in rooms where words still held legal force and was now being asked to stand near a man who looked increasingly like the intensity Rowan had grown used to during a campaign. This was Rowan remained by the side terminal with his pad in hand, more like inventory after impact. He stood at the wall display with the maps open in layers. The structure of a place after the fire had gone out. Rowan set one cup near Marcus's right hand and took the seat across patterns. For a while neither of them spread across the screen outside the small port beside the table. Elegant stars held their positions with the indifference unique to things too old to care about human conclusions. Inhumanly patient. Moved through dark. Marcus looked at it without expression, like absence. Then he said, instead, they executed a diplomatic envoy during a Marcus did not reach for the coffee on an open civil frequency. Rowan wrapped both hands around his own cup and let the silence settle. The Assembly is preparing a condemnation package that silence around Marcus cut across her without raising his voice. It was usually occupied by processes too exact or too heavy to permit language until they had arranged themselves properly. Not because the words were harsh. The silence felt different too. They were too flat to qualify as harsh. Not command silence. They had the clean, load-bearing quality of a statement that had already passed through anger, that arrived only after a man had gone as far as he had to go and discovered at the end Marcus touched the first installation on the map. Answer the question that logistics hub near the corridor. At last Rowan said, "Fuel storage. What are you looking for?" Civilian maintenance crews. He said it as carefully as one listed something fragile that might also be sharp. Their expansion spine runs through 17 remained on the maps for several seconds more. Then he military command notes, folded the top sheet population clean line and set it aside. Not symbolic targets. Nothing, he said. Throughput architecture. Rowan waited. Soren leaned forward toward the port. After a moment he added, points. Found it? No, that was Marcus said. But it was enough to alter the room. Syntax. Not because the half a second no one answered. Marcus turned from the wall and crossed to the desk. Rowan lowered his gaze to the folded map. He picked up one of the folders Rowan had laid there earlier and opened it to a clipped printout that had been too simple a word almost from the beginning. He set the pages on the table in front of Park and Hale. Peace was larger and weaker and more conditional than the thing Marcus had built. Her eyes moved across the opening section. Some part of it had clearly been that. Then back upward. Rowan thought. Slower this time. He found the shape that remained when all the lies were removed. These are demilitarization terms. He drank his coffee, said. It had already gone cold. Park reached for the next page. Resource sharing architecture. Marcus remained motionless, looking out into the dark. Installation list. For the first time in months, he looked up. Rowan could see stillness in him that did not resemble suppression. Marcus inclined his head once. It was not easy. Soren's gaze sharpened. He did not think Marcus would use the same again in any way that could be recognized from a distance. He spent 3 years building the correct pressure of the campaign was gone now. And in its absence, the different kind of weight had become visible. Disagreement, when it arrived, was unpleasant. That was the difficult part. Marcus returned to the wall display. People admired going. They have mistaken diplomatic language for optional language. Visible endurance under crisis. Mistake survives because no one understood how complicated it was to arrive at the end of a thing that had required all of you, General, and then discover you were still suggesting unilateral military action in direct response to a public execution during an open diplomatic process. On the 8th night of transit, the Assembly will require consultation across. The Assembly, because he checked once, has had 9 attempts at threshold and saw Marcus not merely motionless or left unopened, but gone properly. This is not a consultation deficit. The body finally accepted. It is a consequence practicality of exhausted systems. Hale stared at him. That whatever had required absolute vigilance had reached the point where vigilance could be lowered without immediate cost. Not rank. Rowan closed the door again and returned to the outer console. It landed and stayed there. He sat there for a long time with the campaign archive open on his screen. What exactly are you proposing? Treaty Marcus documentation. Picked up a sheet from the desk judicial and handed it to Rowan. Post-conflict corridor assessments. Rowan looked public down. Broadcast the installation file was personnel dry, logs, technical, signal stripped of everything except all of it was required in order to bureaucratic transformation. He read the relevant section to history. He disliked that process more now than civilian logistics personnel. History was useful. 312. Necessary. Military always arrived smooth. 62. Edges lost. Fuel reserves omitted. Maintenance systems. The unbearable cargo small details traded away. Marcus for nodded once. A paragraph now where there had once been 72 capacity. Days of not sleeping Rowan properly. A line item where there has once been a maintenance worker in a Western service branch being told in formal 32 to 40 minutes. Left Marcus at the next turned back to the room. Live if you move now. They built their corridor treaty clause where there had once been a little gray translation, civilian visibility, dead military function. While a room decided that means every installation can be interrupted Rowan without stared at the archive and warning not anger but resistance and transport assumptions are accurate. Hale's face changed. Not because she had not understood the argument. Because she had. You're talking about strikes, she said. Yes. Not if I can help it. Admiral Soren 3 days from
because
Earth,
he was the least
patient and the most
disciplined
about
disguising
for submission to the Assembly, the Joint
General
Chiefs,
Park
and the
next,
historical
broad-shouldered
and silent.
Classification
One
fields,
hand flat on the table
operational
as though he were
scope,
already anchoring
engagement
himself
duration,
against whatever the next
command
hour
authority,
might require.
target
Director
summary,
Hale took the last
post-action
chair with the
treaty
brutal
outcomes.
exactness of
At
someone
the
who had
bottom of
spent
the
her
form
life in
sat the
rooms where
field for
words still
campaign
held legal
designation.
force and was now
Blank.
being asked to
He looked
stand
at it
near
for
a
a
man
long
who
time.
looked increasingly
Operational
like he had
names
moved
were
beyond
usually
needing
generated
legal
by
force to
committee
get what
or
he
selected
wanted.
from abstract
Rowan
language
remained
drained
drained
of
of
any
anything
terminal
too
with his
human
pad
to
in
embarrass
hand.
future review
Marcus
boards.
did not sit. Stability
He
hand.
stood at the wall
Outer
display with
balance.
the maps open
Corridor
in layers.
response.
Corridor
Names
territory
designed to
fuel
sound
dependencies
justified
while
logistics
meaning as
routes,
little as possible.
civilian staffing
Rowan
matrices,
thought of the first
escort
notification
patterns.
printed at
The KEF network
0340
spread across the screen
the coffee
in
cold
precise
on
luminous
Marcus's
lines.
desk. Elegant
The maps
in the way
read
systems
until they
built
became
for long
sentence
expansion
structure.
often were. The warnings
Efficient,
spoken in a dead
scalable,
man's register.
inhumanly patient.
The treaty built out
Marcus
of the exact
looked at it without
infrastructure his
expression.
brother had once hoped
Then he
to
said,
spare. They
clause
executed a
about asking
diplomatic
first.
envoy during
The
a
little
declared
gray
public
node left on
proceeding
the table
on an
where
open
the KEF
KEF
would have to
frequency.
look at it after
Director
the room
Hale
emptied.
began reflexively. The
Elliot.
Assembly is
He sat
preparing a
with the word on the
condemnation
screen.
package and
Read it once.
Marcus cut
then
across
again.
her without raising
It
his
looked right
voice.
immediately, which
I am
was how
aware
he
of
knew
what
it was not
condemnation
only
looks
sentiment.
like. A good
The room went
operational
still.
name did more
Not
than
because
honor.
the words were harsh,
It revealed structure.
because they were not.
This
They
campaign
were
had
too
never
flat
truly
to belong
qualify
to the
as harsh.
strikes.
They
Or
had
even
the
to
clean,
Marcus.
load-bearing
It had
quality
belonged
of a
to the
statement that had
proposition
already
Elliot had
passed
made
through
in the
anger
beginning,
and arrived
that
somewhere
shared
colder.
peace required
Hale
shared
closed her
interruption
mouth.
of force.
Marcus
touched
had
the
only
first installation on the
Elliot
map,
had already
a
understood.
logistics hub near the
Rowan
corridor
submitted
scene.
the file.
Fuel
The
storage.
ship reached Earth
Civilian
on the 11th
maintenance
day of
crews.
transit under a pale
Secondary
morning
escort
sky
traffic.
streaked with cloud
Their
and corridor
expansion
traffic.
spine runs through
From
17
orbit, the
major
planet looked as it
infrastructure
always
sites,
did,
he said.
too large for
Not
individual
military
grief
command
and yet
nodes.
somehow still the
Not
place to which
population
all grief
centers.
insisted on
Not
returning.
symbolic targets.
Oceans bright under the
Throughput online.
architecture. Continent
Soren
edges
leaned
softened
forward
by
slightly.
weather.
You're
The
talking
familiar
about
geometry of
pressure
home
points.
complicated
No,
by the fact
Marcus
that home,
said.
once
I'm
re-entered,
talking about
would now
syntax.
contain versions of
For
them
half a
both that
second
had
no
not
one
existed
answered.
when they left.
Marcus turned
The
from the
formal
wall and
reception
crossed
was
to the
waiting.
desk.
He
Military
picked up
review.
one of the folders Rowan
Assembly
had laid there earlier
representatives.
and opened it
Press
to a
held
clipped
at distance.
printout from Alien's
Security
proposal packet.
choreography.
He set the
Marcus
pages
looked
on the
at the
table
packet
in front
Rowan
and handed
handed
him on
Hale.
dissent.
Director
Read
Hale
the
looked
one-page
down
summary
first.
of who
Her
required his
eyes moved
presence
across the
first.
opening section.
Then set it down.
Then lower.
Reschedule
Then
the
back
assembly
upward.
briefing for
Slower
tomorrow,
this time,
he
as
said.
recognition assembled.
Yes, sir.
These
The
are
press statement goes
demilitarization
through
terms,
Hale,
she said.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
The tribunal
reached for
record
the next
stays
page.
public.
Resource
Yes,
sharing
sir.
architecture.
He said all
Corridor
of this in the
audit
same calm
oversight.
tone he might have used to
Installation list.
rearrange routine
He looked
supply
up.
priorities.
These 17.
Then after a pause
Marcus
he added,
inclined his
I'm
head
going home
once.
first.
Soren's gaze
Rowan
sharpened.
looked at him.
You
Not
think
because
he
the
used the
choice
same
was
map.
shocking.
Marcus
Because it was
looked
the
at him.
first personal
He
instruction
spent 3
Marcus
years
had issued
building
in
the
months.
correct one.
Yes, sir.
Silence followed
Rowan
that.
said.
Not
The house
because the
stood
room
where it had
disagreed.
always stood, because
Small,
agreement when it
quiet,
arrived was
city edge.
unpleasant. A
Marcus
place built
returned
long
to the
before
wall
either
display.
brother had become the
They
shape
have
of man
mistaken
history later
diplomatic
required
language
for
from them.
optional language.
Marcus
he
entered
said.
alone.
That
He
mistake
told security
survives
to
because
remain
nothing has
outside the
forced
gate,
a
and for
revision.
once,
Hale
security
let out
obeyed
one
not
breath,
because
careful
procedure
and
supported
thin.
the order,
General,
but because
with
the man
respect,
giving
if you
it
are
had acquired
suggesting
in the last
unilateral
3 months the
military
kind of
action in
authority
direct
that made
response to a
disagreement
public
feel
execution
structurally
during an
foolish.
open diplomatic
Inside,
process,
the air held
the
the
assembly
faint
will
closed-up
require
scent of a house
consultation
unoccupied
across.
for too long.
The assembly,
Thus,
Marcus said,
old
has had 9
electrical
attempts at formal
and
engagement
underneath it,
returned,
still
so
ignored
faint that
or
another
left
person
unopened.
might have missed it entirely.
This is not a consultation
Burnt toast.
deficit.
Marcus
It is a
stood just
consequence
inside the door
deficit.
without moving.
Hale
The
stared at
kitchen
him.
lay ahead.
Park said
Same
quietly,
table.
Marcus.
Same window.
That was the first
Same
time
pale
anyone
morning
in the room
light
had
coming
used his
through at
name.
an angle he
Not
recognized
rank,
not through
not
memory,
title,
but through the
name.
body's older
It landed
knowledge
and
of where
stayed
the room
there.
kept its
Marcus did
silences.
not react. He crossed to the
Park
table.
continued.
One
What
chair
exactly
slightly
are you
back.
proposing?
The other tucked
Marcus
in.
picked up
He
a
looked
sheet
at them
from the
for a long
desk and
time.
handed it to Rowan.
Then he reached into
Read
the inner
staffing
pocket of his
line.
jacket and took
Rowan
out the
looked
small
down.
gray
The
translation
installation
note.
file was dry, technical, stripped of everything except what systems required in order to function. He read the relevant section aloud. Station KE7. Civilian
Civilian logistics personnel, 312. Military support staff, 62. Fuel reserves, maintenance systems, cargo automation. Marcus nodded once. Now read the evacuation capacity. Rowan found it. Full personnel clearance window, assuming uninterrupted transport lanes, 32 to 40 minutes. Marcus turned back to the room. They built their corridor expansion on dual-use infrastructure. Civilian visibility, military function. That means every installation can be interrupted without mass casualty if warning windows are precise and transport assumptions are accurate. Hale's face changed. Not because she had not understood the argument. Because she had. You're talking about strikes, she said. Yes. They carried it all the way
Admiral
home.
Soren first,
Not because he was the least patient and
not
the most
because he
disciplined
intended
about
ceremony.
disguising impatience
Because
as
some
efficiency.
objects crossed the line
General
between
Park
tool and
next,
witness,
broad-shouldered
and once
and
they
silent,
did,
Throwing them away became a kind of lie.
As though he were already
Marcus set the note on the table,
whatever the next
not
hour
in the
might
center,
require.
at Elian's
Director
place.
Hale took the last
Then he
chair
sat
with
down
the
in his
brittle
own
exactness
chair.
of someone
The
who
house
had
was
spent her
quiet.
life in rooms
No
where
command
words still
traffic.
held legal force,
No
and was
analysts.
now being asked
No
to stand
treaty
near a
language.
man who looked
No
increasingly
people
like he
standing
had
one
moved
pace
beyond
outside
needing
the
legal
radius of
force
his
to get what he
concentration,
wanted.
waiting to be
Rowan
useful.
remained by the
Just the
side
room.
terminal with his
The
pad
morning.
in hand, and the fact
Marcus
that
did
after
not
all the
sit.
work, all the
He stood
precision,
at the wall
all the
display with the
terrible
maps
correctness
open in
of
the
the
answer.
answer,
This
corridor
was what remained at the
territory,
center
fuel
of it.
dependencies,
A table,
logistics
2
routes,
chairs, one
civilian
brother
staffing
absent,
matrices,
one brother still
escort
here.
patterns.
Marcus rested
the
both hands flat
spread
against
across
the
the
wood.
screen in
For the
precise
first
luminous
time
lines,
since the notification
elegant
had
in the way
arrived,
systems
there was
built
no
for long
next instruction
expansion
waiting
often work.
behind his
Efficient,
eyes. No
scalable,
countdown.
inhumanly
No
patient.
target. Marcus
No
looked
sequence
at
to
it without
complete.
expression.
Only grief.
Then he
at
said,
last,
no
they
longer assigned
executed a
task.
diplomatic
He
envoy
sat
during
with
a
it.
declared
The
public
light shifted
proceeding
by
on an
degrees
open
across
civil
the
frequency
surface.
Director Hale
Outside,
began
somewhere down the
reflexively,
street, a delivery
the assembly
truck
is
passed.
preparing a
A dog
condemnation
barked
package
once and
and
stopped.
Marcus
The city,
cut across her
faithful to
without
its
raising
old
his
indecency,
voice.
continued.
I am aware of what
Marcus looked at the
condemnation
translation
looks like.
node. The room
Then
went
at the
still.
window.
Not
Then
because
nowhere
the
at
words
all.
were harsh,
And because no one
because
was
they
there
were
to
not.
witness it,
They were
and
too
because
flat to
something should
qualify
belong
as
to the
harsh.
unwitnessed
They
part
had
of
the
a life
clean,
if they are to remain
load-bearing
true.
quality of a
He let
statement
the
that had
silence in
already
the room
passed
become
through
what
anger
Elian
and
had
arrived
always
somewhere
believed it
colder.
was.
Hale
Not a
closed
wall.
her mouth. Just the place
Marcus
before the
touched
next
the first
word.
installation on
Far
the map.
away in
A
archives
logistics
and
hub
command
near the
systems and
corridor
public
scene.
records that would
Fuel
outlive them
storage.
both.
The
Civilian
campaign name
maintenance
had
crews.
already begun its slow
Secondary
travel through
escort
bureaucracy, history,
Their
and
expansion
speech.
spine runs
Elian,
through
a
17
single
major
word.
infrastructure sites, he
Final.
said. Not large
military
enough to
command
contain the
nodes.
whole of what had
Not
happened.
population centers.
Large enough to point
Not
toward it
symbolic
honestly.
targets.
That was all naming
Throughput
could ever do.
architecture.
Would have
Soren
to be enough.
leaned forward slightly.
Marcus sat at the
You're
kitchen
talking
table
about
while the
pressure
morning
points?
widened around the
No,
house.
Marcus
For the first
said.
time in a very
I'm
long
talking
while,
about
he did
syntax.
not reach for the
For
cold
half a
coffee
second
that was
no
not
one
there.
answered.
He just
Marcus
remained.
turned from the wall
And the
and
story,
crossed to
having
the desk.
done all the
He
damage
picked
it
up
needed
one
to
of the
do,
folders
finally
Rowan
became
had laid
quiet.
there earlier
And opened it to a clipped printout from Elian's proposal packet. He set the pages on the table in front of Park and Hale. Director Hale looked down first. Her eyes moved across the opening section. Then lower. Then back upward, slower this time as recognition assembled. These are demilitarization terms, she said. Yes. Park reached for the next page. Resource sharing architecture. Corridor audit oversight. Installation list. He looked up. These 17. Marcus inclined his head once. Soren's gaze sharpened. You think he used the same map? Marcus looked at him. He spent 3 years building the correct one. Silence followed that. Not because the room disagreed. Because agreement, when it arrived, was unpleasant. Marcus returned to the wall display. They have mistaken diplomatic language for optional language, he said. That mistake survives because nothing has forced a revision. Hale let out one breath, careful and thin. General, with respect, if you are suggesting unilateral military action in direct response to a public execution during an open diplomatic process, the Assembly will require consultation across. The Assembly, Marcus said, has had 9 attempts at formal engagement returned, ignored, or left unopened. This is not a consultation deficit. It is a consequence deficit. Hale stared at him. Park said quietly, Marcus. That was the first time anyone in the room had used his name. Not rank. Not title. Name. It landed and stayed there. Marcus did not react. Park continued, What exactly are you proposing? Marcus picked up a sheet from the desk and handed it to Rowan. Read the staffing line. Rowan looked down. The installation file was dry, technical, stripped of everything except what systems required in order to function. He read the relevant section aloud. Station KE7. Civilian logistics personnel, 312. Military support staff, 62. Fuel reserves, maintenance systems, cargo automation. Marcus nodded once. Now read the evacuation capacity. Rowan found it. Full personnel clearance window, assuming uninterrupted transport lanes, 32 to 40 minutes. Marcus turned back to the room. They built their corridor expansion on dual-use infrastructure. Civilian visibility, military function. That means every installation can be interrupted without mass casualty if warning windows are precise and transport assumptions are accurate. Hale's face changed. Not because she had not understood the argument. Because she had. You're talking about strikes, she said. Yes.